Picture this. You walk into a courthouse to finalize your divorce. You're ready to move on, to close this chapter of betrayal and heartbreak. But you're not walking in alone. In your arms is a 3-week-old baby, your son. And the man who destroyed your marriage has no idea this child exists. Now imagine the look on his face when he sees you coming through those doors, when he realizes that while he was building a new life with his mistress, you were carrying his child. The shock, the disbelief, the absolute devastation when he understands what he's lost. That's exactly what happened to Natalie Rivers on a cold November morning, and what unfolded next will restore your faith in karma, in second chances, and in the power of a mother's love. This is her story, and I promise you, you've never heard anything like it. But before we dive into every emotional moment of Natalie's journey, I want to say hello to all of you beautiful souls out there. Seriously, where are you watching from right now? Are you curled up in bed in New York, stuck in traffic in Los Angeles, having your morning coffee in London? Drop your location in the comments because I love seeing where this incredible community stretches across the globe. And hey, how are you doing today? Really, I want to know. Are you having a good day, a rough one? Whatever it is, I'm glad you're here with me right now. Now, if you're new to this channel, welcome to a place where we tell stories that matter, stories that make you feel something real, something raw, something that stays with you long after the video ends. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Tap that notification bell so you never miss a story. Because what you're about to hear over the next couple of hours is going to take you on an emotional roller coaster that you won't want to end. Trust me on this. This is the kind of story you'll want to share with your best friend, your sister, your mom. So get comfortable, maybe grab some tissues, and let's dive into Natalie's world. The rain hammered against the windshield of Natalie Rivers' 10-year-old Honda Civic like tiny fists demanding entry. She sat in the parking lot of the Monroe County Family Courthouse, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone.
Natalie's phone buzzed on the passenger seat, illuminating with a text from Lena Torres, her attorney and the closest thing to a sister she'd ever had. The message was characteristically brief: he's here. And he's not alone. Of course he wasn't alone. Dominic Ashford, real estate mogul and coward extraordinaire, would never show up to something as significant as his divorce proceedings without his shiny new trophy draped on his arm like an expensive accessory. Natalie had known Simone would be there, had prepared herself for the sight of them together, had practiced maintaining her composure in the bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning while Oliver nursed. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally were two entirely different beasts, and Natalie felt her stomach twist into familiar knots of humiliation and rage. She closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths, a technique her therapist had taught her during one of the handful of sessions she'd been able to afford after Dominic froze their joint bank accounts. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Exhale for 4 counts. Repeat. The anxiety didn't disappear, it never did, but it became manageable, controllable, something she could function around rather than something that paralyzed her completely. When Natalie opened her eyes again, she saw them. Dominic's black Mercedes S-Class, because of course he'd upgraded from the BMW they'd bought together, pulled into a spot near the courthouse entrance, right in front where everyone could see, because Dominic had always needed to be seen, to be noticed, to have his success visible and undeniable. The driver's side door opened first, and Dominic emerged in what Natalie recognized as his Tom Ford charcoal suit, the one he saved for important meetings, the one he claimed made him look like he belonged on the cover of Forbes. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the rain, and even from this distance, Natalie could see he'd gotten more grey at his temples. It actually looked good on him, made him look distinguished rather than old, and she hated that she still noticed these things, still catalogued the details of his appearance as if they mattered. The passenger door opened, and Simone stepped out, somehow managing to make even the simple act of exiting a vehicle look like a performance. She was wearing a white dress, white, to a divorce hearing, as if she were the bride at some twisted ceremony that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. Her long dark hair cascaded over her shoulders in the kind of perfect waves that took either professional styling or an obscene amount of time with hot tools, and her makeup was flawless, camera-ready, because of course it was. Simone DeMarco had 2.3 million Instagram followers who tuned in daily to watch her perform the carefully curated fantasy of her perfect life, a life that now apparently included stealing someone's husband and wearing inappropriate white dresses to divorce proceedings. Dominic said something that made Simone laugh, that high, tinkling sound that probably drove her followers wild but made Natalie want to scream. He placed his hand on the small of her back as they walked toward the courthouse entrance, the same gesture he'd once used with Natalie, and the casual intimacy of it felt like a knife sliding between her ribs. They looked happy. Disgustingly, authentically happy, as if the wreckage of Natalie's life was just an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice on the altar of their great love story. Natalie felt the rage building in her chest, hot and familiar, threatening to overwhelm the carefully constructed calm she'd been maintaining. How dare they? How dare they show up here looking like they were attending a garden party instead of the legal dismantling of an 8-year marriage? How dare Dominic smile like that when just 14 months ago he'd been promising Natalie they'd work on their problems, that things would get better, that he still loved her. But then Oliver made a small sound in his sleep, that tiny whimper that meant he'd be waking soon and would need to eat, and just like that, the rage transformed into something else. Something colder. Something more powerful. Because Dominic had no idea what was walking through those courthouse doors in approximately 10 minutes. He had no idea that his casual betrayal, his careless destruction of their marriage, had consequences that extended far beyond hurt feelings and divided assets. He had no idea that while he was planning his new life with Simone, Natalie had been growing his son, delivering his son, learning to care for his son completely alone. And he was about to find out. Natalie checked her reflection in the visor mirror, touching up the concealer under her eyes that hid the evidence of sleepless nights spent feeding and changing and soothing a newborn. She'd chosen her outfit carefully for this moment, a navy blue wrap dress that accommodated her post-pregnancy body while still looking professional, paired with simple black flats because her feet were still slightly swollen and she'd be damned if she was going to hobble into that courthouse in heels just to prove some kind of point. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore minimal jewelry, just the small gold hoops her foster mother had given her when she graduated high school, the closest thing to a family heirloom she possessed. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who'd given birth 3 weeks ago and was running on approximately 4 hours of sleep. But she also looked strong. Determined. Like someone who'd walked through fire and emerged scarred but standing, and that was exactly what she needed Dominic to see. Oliver began to stir, his tiny fists waving in the air as he transitioned from sleep to wakefulness. Natalie unbuckled her seatbelt and climbed into the back seat, carefully lifting her son from his car seat and cradling him against her chest. He was so small, so impossibly fragile, his entire existence still seeming like some kind of miracle that Natalie didn't quite believe she deserved. His eyes opened, those beautiful green eyes, and he looked up at her with a kind of complete trust that made her heart physically ache. "Hey there, little man," she whispered, running her finger gently along his cheek. "You ready to meet your daddy? He doesn't know about you yet, but that's okay. We're going to walk in there together, you and me, and we're going to show him exactly what he walked away from. We're going to show him what it looks like when someone actually fights for their family instead of just running at the first sign of difficulty." Oliver made a small cooing sound, and Natalie smiled despite the circumstances, despite the anxiety thrumming through her veins like electricity. This tiny human had saved her life in ways he'd never understand. When she'd first seen those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test, the same week the divorce papers arrived, she'd stood in her bathroom for 20 minutes just staring at the stick, trying to process how the universe could be so spectacularly cruel as to give her the baby she'd always wanted at the exact moment her marriage was disintegrating. She'd cried for hours that night, ugly sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest, mourning the future she'd imagined where she told Dominic about their pregnancy and he swept her into his arms with joy. But then something had shifted. As the pregnancy progressed, as she felt Oliver moving inside her, as she prepared for his arrival completely alone, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She discovered that she didn't need Dominic's validation or support to be a mother. She didn't need his permission to love this child with her entire being. And most importantly, she discovered that some betrayals were so complete, so devastating, that they actually set you free because they made the choice to move forward crystal clear. Natalie had made the conscious decision not to tell Dominic about the pregnancy. Some people would call that vindictive, cruel even, but those people didn't understand. She refused to be kept out of obligation. She refused to trap Dominic with a baby he clearly didn't want, refused to force him into playing house when his heart was already living in someone else's penthouse. If Dominic was going to be in Oliver's life, it would be because he chose to be, because he fought for that right, not because some court order said he had to pay child support and show up for scheduled visitations. Oliver deserved better than a father who saw him as a burden, an inconvenience, a mistake. But the time for secrets was over. Today, Dominic would learn the truth, and Natalie would finally see if there was any shred of the man she'd married still living inside the stranger who'd served her with divorce papers. She secured Oliver in his baby carrier, the ergonomic sling that kept him close to her chest, and grabbed the diaper bag from the front seat. Her hands were shaking slightly as she locked the car, and she had to pause for a moment on the wet pavement to steady herself. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, but the sky remained dark and threatening, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. The walk to the courthouse entrance felt both endless and far too short. With each step, Natalie's heart hammered harder against her ribs, her mouth going dry, every worst-case scenario playing out in her mind like a terrible movie. What if Dominic was angry? What if he accused her of entrapment, of deliberately getting pregnant to ruin his new relationship? What if he looked at Oliver and felt nothing, no connection, no love, no desire to be a father? What if Simone made some snide comment about the baby, some cruel remark that Natalie would have to pretend didn't devastate her? But then Oliver shifted against her chest, making that contented little sound that babies make when they feel safe, and Natalie remembered why she was doing this. Not for herself. Not for revenge, though the thought of seeing Dominic's face when he realized what he'd lost did provide a certain dark satisfaction. She was doing this for Oliver because he deserved to know his father, to have that opportunity even if Dominic ultimately chose not to take it. She was doing this because secrets had a way of festering and poisoning everything they touched, and she refused to build her son's life on a foundation of lies and omissions. The courthouse lobby was surprisingly crowded for a Tuesday morning, filled with people in various states of emotional distress and legal preparation. Lawyers in expensive suits conferred with clients in hushed tones. A young couple argued near the security checkpoint, their voices rising above the general murmur until a security guard gave them a warning look. An elderly woman sat alone on a bench, clutching a manila folder to her chest and staring at nothing, her expression suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Natalie spotted Lena immediately. Her attorney stood near the elevators, dressed in her signature power suit, this one a deep burgundy that contrasted beautifully with her dark skin, and scanning the crowd with the focused intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. When Lena's eyes found Natalie, her expression shifted from professional assessment to genuine warmth, and she quickly crossed the lobby to meet her. "There's my warrior," Lena said softly, pulling Natalie into a careful hug that avoided squishing Oliver. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," Natalie replied, and it was mostly true. "Is he upstairs already?" "Conference room 3. With his attorney and his." Lena paused, her lip curling slightly in distaste. "Companion. You can call her his mistress, Lena. That's what she is. I prefer to call her what she actually is, irrelevant to these proceedings." Lena gently touched Oliver's head, her expression softening. "But this little guy? He's about to become very, very relevant. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this today? We can request a postponement if you need more time." Natalie shook her head. "No more delays. No more hiding. It's time." They made their way through security and into the elevator, riding up to the 3rd floor in companionable silence. Natalie could feel Lena's eyes on her, that assessing gaze that had served her well in countless courtrooms, but her attorney didn't press, didn't demand emotional confessions or declarations of readiness. That was one of the things Natalie loved most about Lena. She trusted Natalie to know her own mind, to understand her own capacity and limitations. The hallway outside the conference rooms was quieter, more sterile, with industrial carpet and fluorescent lighting that gave everyone a slightly sickly pallor. Through the small window in the door of conference room 3, Natalie could see Dominic sitting at the large table, his attorney, Gerald Pritchard, a man whose reputation for aggressive tactics preceded him, on his right, and Simone on his left. They were talking, though Natalie couldn't hear the words, and Dominic was gesturing with his hands in that animated way he had when he was explaining something he considered important. He looked good. Damn him, he looked healthy and rested and prosperous, like a man who'd shed a burden rather than abandoned a wife. There were no dark circles under his eyes, no visible signs of guilt or regret. He'd moved on with such apparent ease that it made Natalie wonder if their entire marriage had meant anything to him at all, or if she'd just been a placeholder, someone to fill space and time until someone better came along. "Ready?" Lena asked, her hand on the door handle. Natalie looked down at Oliver, who was awake now and staring up at her with those trusting eyes. She thought about all the moments Dominic had already missed. The first time she'd felt Oliver kick, a flutter like butterfly wings against her ribcage that had made her laugh and cry simultaneously. The agony and triumph of labor, 22 hours of the most intense physical experience of her life. The first time Oliver had nursed, that profound connection that felt like her heart was living outside her body. The midnight feedings, the diaper changes, the tiny smiles that were probably just gas but filled her with indescribable joy anyway. All of it, experienced alone, without the partner who should have been there. But no more. "Ready," Natalie confirmed. Lena opened the door, and the conversation inside the conference room stopped abruptly. 3 heads turned toward the doorway, and Natalie watched in real time as the color drained from Dominic Ashford's face. His mouth literally fell open, his eyes going impossibly wide, his entire body freezing as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. Natalie Rivers, his soon-to-be ex-wife, standing in the doorway with an infant strapped to her chest. Simone's reaction was almost as dramatic. Her perfectly made-up face contorted with confusion, then shock, then something that looked suspiciously like panic. She grabbed Dominic's arm, her long manicured nails digging into his suit jacket, and whispered something urgent that Natalie couldn't hear. Gerald Pritchard, to his credit, recovered more quickly than his client. He stood, his expression professional but wary, clearly trying to calculate what this development meant for his case. "Ms. Rivers," he said formally. "Ms. Torres. Please, come in." Natalie walked into the room with her head held high, her stride confident despite the way her legs wanted to shake. She took the seat directly across from Dominic, close enough that he'd have an unobstructed view of the baby boy he'd unknowingly created. Lena sat beside her, immediately pulling out her tablet and several folders, the picture of professional preparedness. The silence in the room was suffocating. Dominic continued to stare at Oliver with an expression Natalie couldn't quite read, shock, certainly, but also something else. Confusion? Fear? The tiniest hint of something that might have been wonder? His lips moved as if he was trying to form words, but nothing came out. It was Simone who finally broke the silence, her voice hitting that pitch that suggested she was barely controlling her emotions. "Dominic, what is this? Who is that baby?" But Dominic didn't answer her. His eyes were locked on Oliver, and Natalie could see him doing the math, counting backwards, trying to figure out if what he suspected could possibly be true. She watched the realization dawn on his face, watched him put together the timeline, watched him understand that this wasn't some random baby but his son, flesh of his flesh, the consequence of a marriage he'd been so eager to dissolve. "When?" Dominic finally managed to croak out, his voice barely above a whisper. "When did you?" "November 22nd, Natalie replied calmly, her voice steady even though her heart was racing. 3 weeks and 4 days ago. St. Mary's Medical Center. 22 hours of labor. 7 pounds, 9 ounces. 22 inches long. In case you're wondering, he's healthy. Perfect, actually. All his fingers and toes. No complications. I know you were concerned." The sarcasm in that last sentence was sharp enough to cut, and Dominic flinched as if she'd physically struck him. Good, Natalie thought with fierce satisfaction. Let him feel even a fraction of the pain he caused. But you never said, you never told me you were." Dominic stumbled over his words, looking genuinely lost, like a child trying to understand calculus. "Pregnant." Natalie finished for him. "No, I didn't tell you. Mostly because I found out about Oliver the same week you had your attorney serve me with divorce papers. You remember that week, don't you, Dominic? You'd moved out 3 days earlier. Moved directly into Simone's downtown penthouse, if I recall correctly. It didn't seem like the ideal time to share the news that we'd be tied together for at least the next 18 years of our lives." Gerald Pritchard cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his preparation. Ms. Rivers, while I understand this is unexpected information, I'm not sure what relevance it has to today's proceedings. We're here to finalize the division of marital assets, Anne. And to discuss custody arrangements, Lena interrupted smoothly, placing a document on the table and sliding it toward the center. Since Mr. Ashford has a 3-week-old son he's never met, never held, and until approximately 2 minutes ago, didn't even know existed. I believe that makes custody extremely relevant to these proceedings, wouldn't you say, Mr. Pritchard? Dominic's hand shot out and grabbed the document before his attorney could reach it. Natalie watched his eyes scan the paper, Oliver's birth certificate, with both their names clearly listed. Mother, Natalie Ann Rivers. Father, Dominic James Ashford. Date of birth, November 22nd. Time, 3:47 a.m. Weight, 7 pounds 9 ounces. The official record of Oliver's existence, black ink on white paper, undeniable and legally binding. His name is Oliver, Natalie said softly, watching Dominic's face as he stared at their son's birth certificate. Oliver James Rivers. I gave him my last name because you weren't there to have an opinion about it. Something in Dominic's expression cracked at that, some carefully maintained facade crumbling to reveal genuine anguish underneath. He looked up from the document, his eyes meeting Natalie's for the first time since she'd walked into the room, and she saw tears gathering there, unshed but present. Natalie, he whispered, his voice breaking on her name. Why didn't you tell me? And there it was. The question she'd known was coming, the one she'd prepared herself to answer with cold, clinical detachment. But now, sitting across from him with their son between them, Natalie found that all the rehearsed speeches, all the carefully constructed explanations, had evaporated. What came out instead was raw truth. Because I needed to know I could do this without you, she said, her own voice thick with emotion. I needed to know that I was strong enough to be a mother, to provide for my child, to build a life that didn't depend on someone who'd already proven they could walk away when things got difficult. You left me, Dominic. You looked me in the eyes after 8 years together and told me you weren't happy, that you needed space, that our marriage felt like a cage. 2 weeks later, divorce papers. No counseling. No attempt to work things out. Just gone. So when I found out I was pregnant, I made a choice. I chose not to trap you with a baby you clearly didn't want. I chose to protect myself and my son from someone who'd already demonstrated they weren't capable of commitment. But he's my son, Dominic said, and now the tears were falling freely down his cheeks, his composure completely shattered. You should have told me. I had a right to know. You gave up your rights when you gave up on us, Natalie countered, her voice hardening. But I'm not cruel, Dominic. I'm not keeping Oliver from you out of spite or revenge. I'm here, aren't I? I could have disappeared. Changed my name, moved to another state, made sure you never found out. But I didn't do that because Oliver deserves to know his father. He deserves the opportunity to have you in his life. Whether you deserve that same opportunity is another question entirely. Simone had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to step outside, she announced, her voice shrill. This is... I can't. Dominic, I'll be in the hallway. She fled from the room like it was on fire, and nobody tried to stop her. Gerald Pritchard watched her go with an expression that suggested he'd like to follow, but professional obligation kept him rooted to his seat. He looked at Dominic, clearly waiting for instructions from his client, but Dominic seemed to have forgotten anyone else was in the room. His entire focus was on Oliver, studying every visible feature of his son with an intensity that bordered on desperate. Can I? Dominic started, then stopped, swallowing hard. Can I hold him? Natalie's first instinct was to say no, to protect her baby from this man who'd caused so much pain. But then she remembered her own words, Oliver deserved to know his father. And that had to start somewhere, even if that somewhere was a conference room in a family courthouse during divorce proceedings. He needs to be supported carefully, Natalie said, standing and beginning to unbuckle Oliver from his carrier. His head, his neck, you have to be very gentle. She lifted Oliver out, cradling him against her chest for one more moment, breathing in the distinctive newborn smell that was already becoming as necessary to her as oxygen. Then, moving around the table, she approached Dominic and carefully, so carefully, transferred their son into his father's arms for the very first time. Dominic went completely still, barely seeming to breathe as Oliver settled against him. The baby was so small in his arms, so impossibly fragile, and Natalie could see the terror in Dominic's eyes, the fear that he'd somehow hurt this tiny person just by existing in proximity to him. But then Oliver made a small sound, his tiny hand reaching up to grasp at Dominic's tie, and something in Dominic's face transformed. The fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, a profound sense of wonder, of recognition, of connection. "Hi," Dominic whispered to his son, his voice so quiet Natalie barely heard it. "Hi there, Oliver. I'm Dominic. I'm your dad. Oh God, I'm your dad." And then Dominic Ashford, real estate mogul and master of emotional control, broke down completely. Great heaving sobs shook his shoulders as he held his son, tears falling onto Oliver's blue blanket, years of carefully maintained composure dissolving in the face of this tiny human he'd helped create but had never known existed. He kept saying "I'm sorry" over and over, though whether he was apologizing to Oliver or to Natalie or to himself, nobody could quite tell. Natalie stood there watching him, her own emotions a tangled mess she couldn't begin to sort through. Part of her felt vindicated, satisfied to see Dominic confronted with the enormity of what he'd lost. But another part, the part that had loved this man for 8 years, that had believed in their future together, that had imagined raising children with him in a house filled with laughter and love, that part just felt sad. Sad for what could have been. Sad for the family they'd never be. Sad for Oliver, who'd never know what it was like to have both parents under one roof, working together, united in their love for him. Gerald Pritchard broke the spell by clearing his throat pointedly. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should take a brief recess. This is clearly a lot of information to process, and I think my client needs some time to collect himself before we proceed with negotiations." Lena looked at Natalie, silently asking if that was acceptable. Natalie nodded. She gently extracted Oliver from Dominic's arms. The baby had started to fuss, probably hungry, and secured him back in his carrier. Dominic watched every movement as if he was memorizing it, as if he was afraid that if he looked away for even a second, his son would disappear and he'd discover this had all been some elaborate dream. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes, Lena announced, gathering her materials. "And Mr. Pritchard? I'd suggest you and your client have a very serious conversation about what kind of father Mr. Ashford wants to be, because Ms. Rivers has some very strong opinions about custody arrangements, and they're not likely to be flexible if we don't see genuine commitment from your side." Natalie walked out of the conference room without looking back, though she could feel Dominic's eyes burning into her back the entire way. In the hallway, Simone was pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in rapid, agitated tones to someone on the other end. When she saw Natalie emerge, she abruptly ended the call and stalked over, her heels clicking aggressively on the tile floor. "You did this on purpose," Simone hissed, her beautiful face twisted with anger. "You deliberately hid that pregnancy to ruin everything. You're trying to manipulate him into coming back to you." Natalie looked at this woman, this girl, really, because 26 suddenly seemed impossibly young, and felt nothing but pity. "Simone," she said calmly, "I don't want him back. I stopped wanting him back the moment he chose you over our marriage. But that baby in there? He's Dominic's son whether you like it or not, and if you're planning to be part of Dominic's life, you're going to have to accept that Oliver is now part of that equation too. So maybe instead of coming at me with accusations, you should be having a very serious conversation with your boyfriend about whether he's ready to be a father, because that's not a role you can just opt out of when it gets inconvenient." She walked away before Simone could respond, following Lena to a small conference room down the hall that they'd reserved for private consultations. As soon as the door closed behind them, Natalie sank into a chair and let out a long, shaky breath. That, Lena said with something approaching admiration, was the most dramatic reveal I've ever witnessed in 15 years of practicing family law. "How are you feeling?" "I don't know," Natalie admitted. That look on his face when he held Oliver? I wasn't expecting that. I thought he'd be angry, defensive. I didn't expect him to cry. Men often surprise you when confronted with their own offspring, Lena observed, sitting across from Natalie. The biological reality of fatherhood can be a powerful thing. But Natalie, you need to prepare yourself for what comes next. Dominic is going to want custody. Probably joint custody, 50-50 split. And he has the resources to fight for it. Over my dead body, Natalie said fiercely. I'm not letting my 3-week-old son spend nights away from me with a father who doesn't even know how to change a diaper. Dominic can have supervised visitation until he proves he's capable of actual parenting, and even then, we're talking about gradual integration. Oliver's needs come first, not Dominic's ego or his sudden attack of paternal feelings. I'm not disagreeing with you, Lena assured her. I'm just making sure you're prepared for this to get ugly. Dominic's attorney is one of the best in the state, and if Dominic decides he wants this badly enough, he'll throw enormous resources at winning. Let him try, Natalie said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. I've got the one thing money can't buy. I've been Oliver's only parent since the moment he was born. I'm the one who gets up at 2 in the morning when he cries. I'm the one who knows he likes to be patted on the back in a specific rhythm when he's fussy. I'm the one who's learning his cries, who can tell the difference between hungry and tired and uncomfortable. Dominic can hire all the expensive attorneys he wants, but he can't manufacture 3 weeks of parenting experience, and I have to believe that matters. Oliver chose that moment to begin crying in earnest, that escalating wail that meant he was hungry and wanted everyone to know about it immediately. Natalie unzipped the carrier and lifted him out, settling into a chair and beginning the practiced routine of nursing. She'd gotten better at this over the past 3 weeks, more confident in her ability to meet her son's needs, but she still marveled at the strange intimacy of it, the biological reality that her body could provide everything this tiny human required to survive. Lena tactfully turned away, giving them privacy, and pulled out her phone to check messages. The room fell into a comfortable silence broken only by Oliver's contented feeding sounds and the occasional ping of Lena's incoming emails. Outside, in the larger world of the courthouse, other families were navigating their own crises, their own endings and transformations. But in this moment, in this small room, there was just Natalie and Oliver and the fierce protective love that had become the defining force of her existence. When the 30 minutes were up and they returned to conference room 3, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Simone was nowhere to be seen. Natalie would later learn that she'd called an Uber and left the courthouse entirely, unable or unwilling to face the reality of Dominic's instant fatherhood. Dominic sat alone with Gerald Pritchard, and both men looked like they'd been through emotional warfare. Dominic's eyes were red-rimmed, his tie loosened, his perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. But there was something different in his expression now, something harder and more determined than the shock that had characterized his earlier reaction. Ms. Rivers, Gerald began as soon as everyone was seated. My client would like to request immediate joint custody of the minor child, with a 50-50 split of parenting time once the child is weaned from breastfeeding. Natalie actually laughed at that, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. Absolutely not. Dominic has never changed a diaper, never prepared a bottle, never soothed a crying infant at 3 in the morning. He doesn't know Oliver's feeding schedule, his sleep patterns, his likes or dislikes. He's a complete stranger to his own son, and I'm not handing over my 3-week-old baby to someone who has zero practical parenting experience. Then what do you propose? Gerald asked, his tone suggesting he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Lena slid a document across the table. Supervised visitation, she said crisply. Twice a week, 2 hours each session, with Ms. Rivers present. Mr. Ashford will have the opportunity to learn how to care for his son under guidance and supervision. After 3 months, assuming he demonstrates competence and genuine commitment, we can revisit the custody arrangement and discuss unsupervised visitation. After 6 months, if everything is going well, we can discuss overnight visits. But we're going to proceed slowly, with Oliver's needs as the absolute priority. That's unacceptable, Gerald countered. Mr. Ashford has rights as the biological father. Mr. Ashford gave up his rights when he filed for divorce and abandoned his pregnant wife, Lena shot back. Oh wait, he didn't know she was pregnant because he was too busy moving his mistress into a penthouse to notice his wife's morning sickness. My client is being remarkably generous considering the circumstances. She could have never told him about Oliver's existence. She could have moved out of state before the baby was born and made it nearly impossible for Mr. Ashford to establish paternity. But she didn't do any of those things because she believes Oliver deserves to know his father. The question is whether Mr. Ashford deserves to know his son. Dominic, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "I'll take it," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "The supervised visitation. I'll take whatever you're willing to give me, Natalie. I know I don't have the right to demand anything. I know I screwed up so badly that words can't even express it. But that's my son, and I'm begging you, please let me be part of his life. Please give me a chance to learn how to be his father." The raw vulnerability in his voice caught Natalie off guard. This wasn't the confident, self-assured Dominic she'd known for 8 years. This was someone stripped bare, confronted with his own failures, desperately trying to salvage something from the wreckage he'd created. And despite everything, despite the betrayal, the abandonment, the months of agony he'd put her through, Natalie found she couldn't hate him in this moment. She could only feel a profound sadness for all the things they'd lost and would never get back. "I'm not doing this for you," Natalie said finally. "I'm doing this for Oliver. He deserves a father who's present, who's engaged, who actually wants to be in his life. If you can prove you're that person, then yes, you'll have a relationship with your son. But Dominic, I need you to understand something. Being a father isn't about showing up for the fun parts. It's about the 3 a.m. diaper changes and the screaming fits for no apparent reason and the worry that never goes away. It's about putting someone else's needs before your own, every single day, for the rest of your life. If you're not ready for that, if this is just some knee-jerk emotional reaction that's going to fade once the shock wears off, then walk away now. Because Oliver deserves better than a part-time father who treats him like a hobby or an obligation." "I understand," Dominic said, nodding earnestly. "And I know I have to earn this. I know I have to prove myself. Just tell me when and where for the visitations, and I'll be there. I promise you, Natalie. I'll be there." They spent the next 2 hours hammering out the details of the custody arrangement and finalizing the division of marital assets. The house they'd bought together would be sold, with proceeds split evenly. Retirement accounts would be divided according to state law. Dominic agreed to pay child support, a substantial amount given his income, as well as covering Oliver's health insurance and medical expenses. He also agreed to establish a trust fund for Oliver's future education, something Natalie hadn't even thought to request but Gerald had suggested, perhaps trying to demonstrate his client's financial commitment to his newly discovered son. By the time they walked out of the courthouse, it was nearly 3 in the afternoon. The rain had stopped, and weak November sunlight was attempting to break through the clouds. Natalie stood on the courthouse steps, holding Oliver close, watching as Dominic's Mercedes pulled away from the curb. He'd look back at them through the window, his face etched with something between longing and despair, and Natalie had felt an unexpected wave of empathy for him. He'd made terrible choices, catastrophic mistakes that had blown up his life and hurt people who'd loved him. But he was still human. Still capable of growth, potentially, if he was willing to do the work. "You did good in there," Lena said, standing beside her. "You held your ground, protected your son, but didn't slam the door completely shut on Dominic having a relationship with Oliver. That takes real strength and maturity." "I don't feel strong," Natalie admitted. "I feel exhausted. And terrified. What if he's a terrible father? What if I just agree to let someone unreliable and unstable into my son's life?" "Then you'll handle it," Lena assured her. "Just like you've handled everything else that's been thrown at you. You're one of the strongest people I know, Natalie. You walked through hell, gave birth alone, built a life for yourself and your baby from absolutely nothing, and you did it with grace and dignity. Whatever comes next, you'll deal with it. And you won't be alone. I'm not just your attorney, I'm your friend. I've got your back." Natalie felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but these were different from the tears she'd shed over the past months. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of recognition that maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. They'd all be okay. She drove home to her tiny one-bedroom apartment in a less fashionable part of town, the place she'd moved to after Dominic froze their joint accounts and she could no longer afford their townhouse. It wasn't much. The carpet was worn, the kitchen appliances outdated, the bathroom in desperate need of renovation. But it was hers. She'd made it into a home, decorating with thrift store finds and her own artwork, creating a space that felt safe and warm and full of love despite its modest circumstances. Oliver's bassinet sat beside her bed, close enough that she could reach out and touch him in the middle of the night. His tiny wardrobe, mostly hand-me-downs from Lena's sister and items from the hospital charity closet, was neatly organized in a dresser she'd painted a cheerful yellow. The rocking chair she'd found on Craigslist for $30 sat by the window, positioned to catch the afternoon light, and Natalie had spent countless hours in that chair nursing Oliver and watching the world go by outside. That evening, after Oliver was fed and changed and sleeping peacefully in his bassinet, Natalie allowed herself to really process what had happened. She'd done it. She'd faced Dominic, revealed Oliver's existence, and survived the encounter. More than survived, she'd emerged with her dignity intact and a custody arrangement that protected her son's well-being. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Her thumb hovered over the delete button, but curiosity got the better of her. It's Dominic. Lena gave me your number for scheduling purposes. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for not shutting me out completely. Thank you for giving me a chance to know my son. I know I don't deserve it. I know I have a long way to go to earn your trust and Oliver's. But I'm going to try. I promise you, I'm going to try. When can I see him again? Natalie stared at the message for a long time, her emotions churning. Finally, she typed out a response, Saturday. 2 p.m. My apartment. Bring a notebook, you're going to be learning how to change diapers. His response came almost immediately, I'll be there. Thank you, Natalie. For everything. She set her phone aside and looked over at her sleeping son, this beautiful, perfect little human who had saved her life in more ways than one. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges lay ahead with co-parenting and custody arrangements and all the complicated mess of having Dominic permanently woven into the fabric of their lives, she'd face it the same way she'd faced everything else over these past months, with love, determination, and the unshakable knowledge that Oliver deserved the very best version of both his parents, and she'd fight like hell to make sure he got it. The story of how Natalie Rivers and Dominic Ashford ended up in a courthouse, separated by divorce papers and a secret baby, began not with betrayal but with hope. It began 14 months earlier, on a crisp October evening, in an upscale Italian restaurant called Bella Vista that Dominic had chosen specifically because it was where they'd had their first date 8 years prior. The gesture should have been romantic, a nod to their shared history, but Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the smile Dominic wore didn't quite reach his eyes. They'd been married for 6 years at that point, together for 8 total, and Natalie had spent the last 18 months gently, carefully, increasingly desperately trying to initiate conversations about starting a family. At 32, she felt the biological clock ticking with increasing urgency, but more than that, she felt ready. She'd built a successful career as an art curator at the Riverside Gallery, had established herself in their community, had created a stable, loving home. She wanted to share all of that with a child, wanted to experience the profound joy and terror of parenthood with the man she loved. Dominic, however, had been maddeningly non-committal on the subject. He'd say soon, or let's wait until after this project finishes, or I want to make sure we're financially stable first, despite the fact that his real estate development company was thriving and they were more than comfortable. Every time Natalie brought up babies, Dominic found a reason to deflect, delay, or change the subject entirely. That anniversary dinner was supposed to be different. Natalie had decided she was done with hints and gentle suggestions. She was going to be direct, honest, and vulnerable about what she wanted their future to look like. She'd rehearsed the conversation in her head a dozen times, trying to find the words that would help Dominic understand how deeply she needed this, how her desire for motherhood wasn't just some passing whim but a fundamental part of who she was. They'd ordered their meals, she got the butternut squash ravioli she always ordered, he got the seafood risotto he claimed no one made better than Bella Vista, and there was small talk about work, about the new development Dominic was working on, about the upcoming exhibition Natalie was curating featuring emerging local artists. But underneath the surface conversation, Natalie could feel her anxiety building, her carefully prepared speech playing on a loop in her mind. Dom, she finally said, reaching across the white tablecloth to take his hand. I want to talk about something important. He looked up from his risotto, and Natalie saw something flicker across his face. Was it wariness? Resignation? She couldn't quite identify it, but it made her stomach tighten with apprehension. I'm ready, she continued, her voice steady despite her nerves. Ready to start a family. Ready to be a mom. We've talked about this before, but I need you to hear me, really hear me. I'm not getting any younger, and I don't want to wait anymore. I want to have a baby with you. I want to create a family with you. I want to watch you be a father and experience all of those milestones together. So what I'm asking is, can we start trying? Like, actually trying, not just saying someday but making a real plan and commitment. She'd expected several possible reactions. Enthusiasm, maybe, or cautious agreement, or even honest concerns about timing or readiness that they could discuss and work through together. What she hadn't expected was the way Dominic's face seemed to close off completely, like shutters slamming down over windows, blocking any view of what he was actually thinking or feeling. Soon, he said, and the word landed between them like a stone dropping into still water. I promise, national. Soon. I just need a little more time to get the Johnson Street development off the ground. Once that's established, once we're past this busy season, we can really focus on it. You said that 6 months ago, Natalie pointed out, trying to keep the frustration out of her voice and failing. About the Riverside project. And before that, it was the harbor renovation. There's always going to be another project, Dom. There's always going to be a reason to wait. At what point do we stop waiting and start living the life we've been planning? Dominic pulled his hand back from hers, and that simple gesture felt like rejection, like a physical manifestation of the emotional distance that had been growing between them for months. I'm not saying never, Natalie. I'm saying not right now. Why is that so hard for you to accept? Because I don't think you actually want children, Natalie said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, giving voice to the fear that had been growing in her chest like a tumor. I think you keep saying soon and maybe and we'll see it because you're hoping I'll eventually drop it, that I'll just accept a childless life because it's easier, because it doesn't require you to change or grow or make space for anyone else in your perfectly ordered existence. That's not fair, Dominic protested, but his voice lacked conviction, and he couldn't quite meet her eyes when he said it. Isn't it? When was the last time you actually engaged with this conversation instead of deflecting? When was the last time you said, let's talk about what starting a family would actually look like instead of finding another excuse to postpone? They'd argued in tense whispers right there in Bella Vista, both acutely aware of the other diners around them, trying to maintain some semblance of public civility while their marriage began to crack at its foundation. The evening ended with cold silence on the drive home, with Dominic disappearing into his home office to catch up on work while Natalie cried alone in their bedroom, mourning the romantic anniversary she'd imagined and confronting the painful reality that her husband might not want the same future she did. What Natalie didn't know, couldn't have known, was that underneath the table at Bella Vista, Dominic had been texting someone throughout their dinner. Someone named Simone, who he'd met 3 weeks earlier at a networking event and who made him feel young and exciting and unburdened by expectations of mortgages and marriage and babies. Simone, who at 26 had her whole life ahead of her and wasn't asking him for anything more complicated than his attention and his American Express card. Simone, who laughed at all his jokes and posted Instagram stories that made his life look glamorous and enviable to his business associates. The affair had started innocently enough, or at least that's what Dominic would tell himself later, as if innocently could ever describe the deliberate betrayal of a marriage. A few flirty text messages. A coffee meeting that turned into lunch. Lunch that turned into dinner. Dinner that turned into drinks at her apartment. And suddenly Dominic was living a double life, splitting his time between the stable, predictable world he'd built with Natalie and the exciting, unpredictable escape that Simone represented. Simone DeMarco hadn't set out to be a homewrecker, at least not consciously. She'd grown up in suburban Connecticut, the youngest of 4 children in a family where money was always tight and attention was divided 4 ways. She'd learned early that beauty could be currency, that the right photo on Instagram could open doors that academic achievements never would, and by her early 20s she'd built a substantial following by documenting her life in carefully curated images that suggested wealth and sophistication she didn't actually possess. Meeting Dominic had been a goldmine. Here was a successful, handsome, older man who could provide the lifestyle Simone had been pretending to live for her followers. He had the penthouse, the luxury car, the black credit card, all the markers of success that translated so beautifully to social media. The fact that he was married barely registered as a complication in Simone's mind. She'd seen enough of her friends' parents' divorces to know that marriage was rarely permanent anyway, and besides, Dominic had made it clear from the beginning that his marriage was essentially over, that he and his wife were just going through the motions. "We don't even sleep in the same bed anymore," he told her one night, which was a complete lie but one Simone had wanted to believe. "We're basically roommates at this point. The only reason we haven't divorced yet is because it's complicated with the house and the finances." But emotionally? That relationship ended a long time ago. Simone had believed him because believing him meant she could have what she wanted without feeling like a terrible person. She could post photos of their dates, of the expensive restaurants and weekend getaways, tagging locations that made her followers swoon with envy, all while telling herself that she wasn't actually breaking up a marriage because the marriage was already broken. But while Dominic and Simone were building their fantasy relationship, Natalie was living in an increasingly confusing reality. After their anniversary dinner blow-up, Dominic had become distant in ways both subtle and obvious. He worked later hours, claimed more business trips, and when he was home, he was physically present but emotionally absent, his mind clearly elsewhere. He stopped initiating sex, stopped engaging in the small intimate moments that had characterized their relationship, the casual touches while passing in the kitchen, the shared jokes that no one else would understand, the comfortable silence that came from really knowing another person. Natalie tried everything to bridge the gap. She planned date nights that Dominic cancelled at the last minute. She bought lingerie that went unworn because by the time she gathered the courage to put it on, Dominic was too tired or had an early meeting. She suggested couples counseling and Dominic agreed but then could never find time in his schedule to actually attend any sessions. She watched her marriage deteriorating in slow motion, and the worst part was that she couldn't even pinpoint exactly what was wrong, couldn't identify the specific problem she needed to fix. The truth revealed itself on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 3 months after that disastrous anniversary dinner. Natalie had left work early with a migraine and came home to find Dominic's car in the driveway, unusual for a Tuesday, when he typically had client meetings all afternoon. She'd walked into their bedroom to find evidence of his infidelity in the form of a woman's bracelet on her nightstand, expensive and delicate and definitely not hers. Her first thought, bizarrely, was that maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was from months ago, from before they'd gotten married, some forgotten remnant of Dominic's bachelor days. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation that would make sense of this delicate silver chain with its tiny diamond charms. But then Dominic had come out of the bathroom, and the look on his face when he saw her holding that bracelet told Natalie everything she needed to know. Guilt. Fear. And underneath it all, something that looked almost like relief, as if he was tired of maintaining the pretense and was grateful to finally have everything out in the open. "How long?" Natalie had asked, her voice surprisingly steady considering her entire world was crumbling around her. "Nat, I can explain." "How long?" "For months," Dominic admitted, and that number hit Natalie like a physical blow. For months. For months of lies and sneaking around and betrayal. For months of her trying to fix whatever was broken in their marriage while Dominic was actively destroying it from the inside out. "Do you love her?" Natalie had forced herself to ask, even though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dominic had hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. "I don't know," he'd said finally. "I don't know what I feel. I'm confused, Natalie. I need time to figure this out." "You need time," Natalie had repeated, her voice hollow. "You need time. You've been sleeping with someone else for 4 months, bringing her into our home, into our bed, and you need time to figure out how you feel." The fight that followed was nuclear. 8 years of relationship, 6 years of marriage, all of it exploding in accusations and tears and rage. Dominic tried to blame Natalie, claimed she'd been pressuring him too much about having children, that she didn't understand how much stress he was under at work, that their relationship had become all obligation and no passion. Natalie had screamed that pressure didn't justify betrayal, that if he was unhappy he should have talked to her, gone to therapy, done literally anything except cheat. It had ended with Dominic packing a bag and leaving, claiming he needed space to think. He'd gone straight to Simone's apartment, moved in within a week, and had his attorney serve Natalie with divorce papers 2 weeks after that. No counseling. No attempt at reconciliation. Just a clean, brutal cut, as if their entire relationship could be severed as easily as signing some legal documents. Those weeks after Dominic left were the darkest of Natalie's life. She'd call in sick to work and spend entire days in bed, unable to muster the energy to even shower. She'd lost 12 pounds because food tasted like sawdust and eating felt like an insurmountable task. She'd scroll through Simone's Instagram, torturing herself with images of her husband's new life, seeing them at restaurants she and Dominic used to frequent, recognizing her husband's hand in photos even when he wasn't fully visible in frame. The only person who'd kept Natalie tethered to reality during those weeks was Lena Torres. They'd met for years earlier when Lena had handled the legal work for the gallery's acquisition of a disputed estate collection, and they'd bonded over shared experiences of growing up in foster care, of building lives from nothing, of understanding what it meant to be truly alone in the world. When Natalie had called Lena crying so hard she could barely speak, Lena had driven over immediately with groceries, cleaning supplies, and the kind of tough love that Natalie desperately needed. "You're allowed to fall apart," Lena had told her, stripping Natalie's bed and remaking it with fresh sheets while Natalie sat on the floor watching. "You're allowed to grieve what you've lost. But you're not allowed to disappear into this grief. You're not allowed to let this man's betrayal define the rest of your life. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to shower, yes, right now, I'll wait. Then you're going to eat the soup I brought because you look like you haven't had a real meal in days. And then we're going to talk about how to protect yourself legally and financially, because I guarantee you Dominic and his expensive attorney are already strategizing about how to minimize what you're entitled to in the divorce." Lena had been right, of course. Dominic had frozen their joint bank accounts, claiming he needed to preserve marital assets. He'd had his attorney file paperwork asserting that Natalie's salary from the gallery meant she could support herself and didn't need spousal support. He was trying to walk away from their marriage with as much of his wealth intact as possible, leaving Natalie to rebuild from the scraps. But Lena was a fighter, and she'd built her career on representing people in situations exactly like Natalie's. She'd filed emergency motions to unfreeze enough money for Natalie to survive while the divorce proceeded. She demanded full financial disclosure from Dominic's company, knowing that successful business owners often hid assets during divorce. She'd fought for Natalie when Natalie was too broken to fight for herself. And slowly, painfully, Natalie had begun to rebuild. She'd found the cheap one-bedroom apartment. She'd started going back to work, throwing herself into the gallery's operations as a distraction from her imploding personal life. She'd begun therapy with a counselor who specialized in trauma and betrayal. She'd started taking long walks in the evenings, trying to reconnect with her body, with the physical world, with the reality that life continued even when it felt like it shouldn't. She'd also started painting again for the first time in years. Before the gallery job, before Dominic, before the carefully constructed adult life she'd built, Natalie had been an artist. She'd studied fine arts in college on a scholarship that had been her ticket out of the foster care system, had dreamed of making a living through her own creative work. But practical concerns had gradually pushed that dream aside. Art didn't pay consistently, and someone who'd grown up with nothing couldn't afford to take risks with financial instability. But now, with her marriage ending and her carefully planned future disintegrating, Natalie had found herself pulling out her old supplies and painting with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She painted abstract pieces full of raw emotion, slashes of red and black, churning grays and blues, occasional bright spots of color fighting through the darkness. Her therapist said it was healthy, this physical manifestation of processing trauma. Natalie just knew it was the only thing that made her feel remotely human. And then, approximately 3 months after Dominic had left, approximately 6 weeks after she'd received the divorce papers, approximately 2 weeks after she'd signed them with hands that shook so badly Lena had to steady them, Natalie had started feeling sick. At first, she'd attributed it to stress. Of course her body was rebelling, she'd been through hell, was barely sleeping, was probably not eating enough despite Lena's efforts to keep her fed. The nausea, the exhaustion, the tender breasts, all of it made perfect sense as symptoms of extreme stress and grief. But then she'd missed her period. And then missed the next one. And suddenly, with a growing sense of horror and impossibility, Natalie had found herself standing in the pharmacy aisle staring at pregnancy tests, her mind racing through the timeline. The last time she and Dominic had had sex had been, it had been right before that anniversary dinner. A rare moment of connection in what had become a desert of intimacy. She'd actually felt hopeful afterward, had thought maybe they were turning a corner, maybe things would start to get better. Instead, Dominic had served her with divorce papers 3 weeks later. Natalie had bought 3 different brands of pregnancy tests, needing multiple confirmations of what her body was already telling her. She'd locked herself in the bathroom of her tiny apartment and peed on all 3 sticks, then sat on the closed toilet lid watching those little windows, waiting for the results that would either confirm or deny the suspicion that was rapidly becoming certainty. 2 pink lines. Pregnant 2 to 3 weeks. A clear plus sign. All 3 tests, all positive. She was pregnant. Pregnant with Dominic's baby. Pregnant at the exact moment when their marriage was being legally dissolved. Pregnant when her ex-husband was already living with another woman, building a new life that explicitly didn't include her. The irony was so brutal it would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. For 18 months, Natalie had begged Dominic for a baby, had tried to convince him they were ready, that they could handle parenthood together. He'd refused, delayed, made excuses. And now when he was gone and their marriage was over and she was more alone than she'd ever been, now she was pregnant with the child they'd never planned. Natalie had sat on that bathroom floor for over an hour, crying so hard she made herself sick, the positive pregnancy tests scattered around her like accusations. What was she supposed to do? Tell Dominic? Demand he come back because of the baby? The thought made her stomach turn. She didn't want Dominic to stay with her out of obligation or guilt. She'd watched enough of her foster siblings trapped in toxic family situations to know that bringing a child into a relationship based on resentment rather than love was cruel to everyone involved. But could she raise a baby alone? She barely made enough money to support herself. She had no family to help, her parents were dead, she'd aged out of the foster care system at 18 with no siblings she kept in contact with, had built her adult life completely alone. Yes, she had Lena, but Lena had her own career, her own life. Natalie couldn't expect her friend to become a co-parent just because she'd gotten accidentally pregnant by a man who'd already proven he didn't want commitment. For one dark moment, sitting on that bathroom floor, Natalie had considered abortion. Not because she didn't want the baby, but because the practical realities of single motherhood seemed insurmountable. How would she afford childcare while working? How would she handle the medical bills? How would she navigate all the million things babies needed when she had almost no financial resources? But even as she considered it, Natalie knew she couldn't go through with it. This baby, unwanted by its father and inconvenient in its timing, was still a miracle. Still the child Natalie had dreamed of having. Still a chance at the family she'd always wanted, even if that family looked nothing like what she'd imagined. So she'd made a decision, sitting there on her bathroom floor surrounded by positive pregnancy tests. She was going to have this baby. She was going to do it alone. And she wasn't going to tell Dominic because she refused to trap him, refused to force him into a relationship with a child he clearly didn't want. If he was going to be a father, it would be because he chose it, because he fought for it, not because some court order said he had to pay child support. The decision made, Natalie had pulled herself together and started planning. She'd researched pregnancy on a tight budget, finding free prenatal vitamins at the health department and enrolling in a state insurance program for pregnant women with limited income. She'd gone to her first ultrasound alone, her hand gripping her phone so hard it hurt, wanting desperately to call someone but having no one to call who would understand the complicated mix of joy and grief and terror she was feeling. But she'd heard the heartbeat, that fast, fluttering whoosh 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 that sounded like a tiny war drum, and something in Natalie had shifted permanently. This wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. This was a real person growing inside her, depending on her, trusting her to keep them safe and healthy. And Natalie had fallen in love in that moment with an intensity that surprised her, a fierce protective love that eclipsed every other emotion and gave her a purpose that extended beyond her own pain. She'd told Lena about the pregnancy during their weekly coffee date, dropping the news casually as if it wasn't completely life-altering. Lena had nearly spit out her latte, eyes going wide with shock, before breaking into the biggest smile Natalie had seen on her face in months. "You're going to be a mom," Lena had said with wonder. "Oh, national. This is I mean, the timing is terrible and you're going to be exhausted and broke, but you're going to be a mom. You're going to be amazing at it. You think so? Natalie had asked, needing reassurance even though she'd already made her decision. I know so. You're one of the strongest, most capable people I've ever met. If anyone can handle single motherhood, it's you. And you won't be completely alone, I'm here. I'll help however I can. We'll figure this out together. And they had figured it out day by day, challenge by challenge. Lena had connected Natalie with resources, a church group that provided free maternity clothes, a women's shelter that had a lending library of baby equipment, an online group of single mothers who shared advice and support. Natalie had picked up freelance work in the evenings, selling her paintings online and doing commission pieces to build up a small financial cushion for the baby's arrival. The pregnancy had been physically challenging, morning sickness that lasted well into the second trimester, back pain that made sleeping difficult, swollen ankles that turned her feet into unrecognizable stumps. But emotionally, oddly, it had been healing. Every kick from the baby, every milestone at each prenatal appointment, reminded Natalie that she was creating something beautiful from the wreckage of her marriage. She was building a family, just not the family she'd originally planned. She'd prepared for Oliver's arrival with meticulous care, reading every parenting book the library had, taking free classes at the hospital on infant care and breastfeeding, packing and repacking her hospital bag to make sure she had everything she'd need. She'd set up the bassinet in her bedroom, organized tiny harnesses by size, practiced installing the car seat 3 times to make sure it was secure. And through it all, Dominic had no idea. He was living his new life with Simone, posting photos online of their trips to wine country and their attendance at gallery openings and charity galas. He looked happy, unburdened, like a man who'd successfully escaped an unhappy situation and landed in something better. Natalie had stopped looking at his social media after the second trimester. It hurt too much, and besides, she needed to focus on her own future rather than mourning the past. Labor had started 3 days before Oliver's due date, contractions that began as mild cramping and gradually intensified until Natalie knew it was time. She'd called Lena, who'd met her at the hospital, and together they'd gone through the grueling process of bringing new life into the world. 22 hours of labor, because apparently Oliver was as stubborn as both his parents. Hours of pain that medicine only partially touched, nurses cycling through shifts, doctors checking dilation and discussing interventions. But finally, in the early morning hours when the hospital was quiet and the world felt suspended between night and day, Oliver James Rivers had been born. 7 pounds, 9 ounces of squalling, perfect humanity, his tiny fists waving in protest at being ejected from his warm, comfortable home. The nurse had placed him on Natalie's chest, and she'd looked down at her son, and felt like her heart was simultaneously breaking and healing, like every piece of her that Dominic had shattered was being carefully reassembled by this tiny person who didn't even know her yet but already owned her completely. "Hi baby," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hi Oliver. I'm your mama. I've been waiting so long to meet you." Lena had been crying too, taking photos on her phone, documenting this moment when Natalie's life transformed from before baby to after baby. There had been no proud father pacing the waiting room, no extended family crowding around to admire the newborn, no celebration of a new addition to a complete family unit. Just Natalie and Oliver and Lena, creating their own version of family from love and determination and the fierce commitment to show up for each other. The first 3 weeks with Oliver had been the most challenging and rewarding of Natalie's life. She'd been prepared, theoretically, for the sleep deprivation and constant feedings and endless diaper changes. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it physically were 2 completely different things. There were nights when Oliver would scream inconsolably for hours and Natalie would cry right along with him, exhausted and overwhelmed and terrified she was doing everything wrong. But there were also moments of such pure joy they took her breath away. Oliver's first real smile, his eyes focusing on her face and recognizing her as the source of food and comfort and safety. The weight of him sleeping on her chest, his breathing synchronized with hers. The primal satisfaction of knowing her body could nourish his, that she was literally keeping him alive through the milk she produced. She'd learned his cries, the hungry cry versus the tired cry versus that something hurts and I need help cry. She'd figured out that he liked to be bounced in a specific rhythm when he was fussy, that he slept better slightly elevated because of mild reflux, that he needed complete darkness and white noise to sleep more than 20 minutes at a time. She'd become an expert in this tiny human's needs and preferences, could anticipate what he needed sometimes before he even started crying. And not once, in those 3 exhausting, beautiful weeks, had Natalie regretted her decision to keep Oliver's existence secret from Dominic. Every time she looked at her son, she felt certain she'd made the right choice. If Dominic was going to be a father, he needed to choose it, to fight for it, to prove he was capable of showing up for someone other than himself. But as the divorce proceedings approached, as the date on the calendar loomed closer, Natalie had known the time for secrets was ending. She couldn't keep Oliver hidden forever, it wasn't fair to any of them. Dominic had a right to know he had a son, and Oliver had a right to at least have the option of knowing his father. Whether Dominic would step up or run away remained to be seen, but Natalie owed it to her son to give his father that chance. And so she'd walked into that courthouse, Oliver strapped to her chest, ready to detonate a bomb in the middle of Dominic's carefully reconstructed life. Ready to see if the man she'd once loved was capable of being the father their son deserved. The hallway outside Conference Room 3 in the Monroe County Family Courthouse was painfully ordinary for a location where lives were regularly unmade and remade. Beige walls decorated with generic landscape paintings. Industrial carpet in a pattern designed to hide stains. Uncomfortable plastic chairs where people waited for their turn to legally end relationships that had once been built on love and hope. The fluorescent lighting gave everyone a slightly sickly appearance, and the air conditioning kept the temperature just uncomfortable enough that Natalie found herself shivering slightly despite her wrapped dress. Simone DeMarco stood near the water fountain, her white dress, white, as if she were some kind of virginal bride rather than the other woman, a stark contrast to the institutional beige surrounding her. She was scrolling through her phone with practiced efficiency, occasionally pausing to snap a photo of herself. Even here, even now, maintaining her Instagram presence was automatic, an ingrained habit that transcended circumstances. Natalie watched with a kind of detached fascination as Simone cycled through several poses, finding her angles, checking the lighting, all in the hallway of a courthouse during her boyfriend's divorce proceedings. When Simone finally noticed Natalie's return, her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, why was this woman just standing there staring? Recognition, oh right, that's Dominic's ex-wife. And then, as her eyes dropped to Oliver sleeping peacefully against Natalie's chest, something that looked like genuine panic. "You're back," Simone said unnecessarily, her voice carrying an edge of hostility that wasn't quite concealed by her attempt at casual observation. "I am," Natalie confirmed, adjusting Oliver's blanket even though it didn't need adjusting, just needing something to do with her hands. Lena needed to make some calls. "I thought I'd wait out here." This was a lie. Lena was inside the conference room, probably going through documents and preparing for the next round of negotiations. But Natalie found herself drawn to this hallway confrontation, curious to see how Simone would handle the reality of Dominic's instant fatherhood when she couldn't escape into an Uber like she'd done after the initial reveal. Simone stepped closer, and Natalie could smell her perfume, something expensive and floral that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly grocery budget. Up close, Simone was even more beautiful than her carefully curated photos suggested. Flawless skin, perfectly shaped eyebrows, lips enhanced with filler that managed to still look natural. She was objectively stunning, and Natalie felt a sharp stab of the inadequacy she'd been trying to overcome for months. Of course Dominic had chosen this woman. Of course he'd looked at Simone's youth and beauty and excitement and decided that was preferable to Natalie's comfortable familiarity and increasingly desperate desire for children. "How old?" Simone asked, gesturing toward Oliver with one manicured finger but not coming close enough to actually touch him. 3 weeks and 4 days. Simone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And you just decided not to tell Dominic? For 9 months, you knew you were pregnant with his baby, and you said nothing." "I found out I was pregnant the same week Dominic served me with divorce papers," Natalie said, keeping her voice level and factual. "The same week he moved in with you, actually. So forgive me for not thinking that was the ideal time to share the news." And honestly, Simone, Dominic had already made it abundantly clear he didn't want children. He'd been refusing to even discuss starting a family for months before he left. So when I found myself pregnant and alone, I made a choice. I chose not to trap him with a responsibility he'd repeatedly indicated he didn't want. That's not how it works, Simone said, her voice rising slightly. You can't just unilaterally decide that a father doesn't get to know about his own child. It's manipulative. It's cruel. Natalie felt a laugh bubbling up in her chest, sharp and bitter. You're going to lecture me about manipulation? You, who knowingly slept with a married man? Who helped him destroy an 8-year relationship? You want to talk to me about cruelty? Simone's face flushed, 2 spots of color appearing high on her carefully contoured cheekbones. Dominic's marriage was already over when I met him. He told me you two were basically roommates, that the relationship had been dead for years. And you believed him, Natalie said, not as a question but as a statement. Of course you did. Because believing him meant you could have what you wanted without feeling like a terrible person. But here's some truth for you, Simone. Dominic and I were fine until about 6 months before he left. We had problems, sure, every long-term relationship does. But we were working on them, or at least I thought we were. The real issue was that I wanted children and Dominic didn't, and instead of being honest about that incompatibility, instead of giving me the respect of a direct conversation so we could make informed decisions about our future, he just left. He found someone younger and less complicated and more willing to pretend that Instagram posts and expensive dinners are what actually matters in life. That's not fair, Simone protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Nothing about this situation is fair, Natalie agreed. It's not fair that Dominic betrayed 8 years of history. It's not fair that you helped him do it. It's not fair that I had to go through pregnancy and labor completely alone. It's not fair that Oliver is going to grow up in a broken family because his father couldn't keep his pants zipped. None of it is fair, Simone. But it's reality, and now we all have to deal with it. Oliver stirred against Natalie's chest, making small sounds that indicated he'd be waking soon. Simone's eyes dropped to the baby, and Natalie saw something flicker across her face. Fear, maybe? Or resignation? The recognition that this tiny human had just permanently complicated the fantasy life she'd been building with Dominic. I didn't sign up for this, Simone said quietly, more to herself than to Natalie. I know, Natalie replied, and she found that despite everything, despite the anger and pain and betrayal, she felt a strange sort of pity for this woman who'd thought she was getting a wealthy, child-free boyfriend and instead found herself tangled in the messy reality of instant stepmotherhood. But neither did I, and yet here we are. The door to conference room 3 opened, and Dominic emerged, his face still red and blotchy from crying. When he saw Natalie and Simone standing close together in the hallway, his expression shifted to something between fear and embarrassment, as if he'd been caught in yet another betrayal. Sim, he started, reaching for her, but Simone stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself in a gesture that looked almost protective. I can't do this, Simone said, her voice cracking slightly. I can't, Dom. I thought we were building something together. Something uncomplicated and fun and exciting. But this? She gestured toward Oliver without quite looking at him. This is the opposite of uncomplicated. This is you having a secret baby with your ex-wife. This is custody battles and child support and your whole life revolving around someone else. I didn't want any of that, and I'm not going to pretend I did just because the situation changed. Simone, please, Dominic said, desperation creeping into his voice. We can figure this out. We can make it work. How? Simone demanded. How are we going to make it work when you have a newborn? When you're going to be doing supervised visitations and eventually shared custody? When every decision you make for the next 18 years has to factor in this child? I wanted to travel, Dom. I wanted spontaneous weekend trips and late nights out and the freedom to live our lives however we wanted. And you wanted that too, you told me you wanted that. But now everything's different, and I can't. She pulled out her phone and opened an app, presumably calling for a ride. Dominic watched her, seeming frozen, unable to mount an effective argument because everything she was saying was true. Having a child, especially an infant, would fundamentally alter his life in ways that made his casual relationship with Simone almost impossible to maintain in its current form. So that's it? Dominic asked, his voice hollow. You're just leaving. I'm doing exactly what you did to her, Simone said, nodding toward Natalie. I'm choosing myself. I'm walking away from something that isn't working rather than staying out of obligation or guilt. You should understand that better than anyone. The barb landed, and Dominic flinched visibly. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? That Simone was wrong to prioritize her own needs and desires? That she should stay with him despite the massive complication his life had just become? He'd done the exact same thing to Natalie, justified his choices with the exact same logic Simone was now using against him. A black sedan pulled up outside the courthouse, and Simone headed for the doors without looking back. Dominic called after her once, "Simone, wait," but she didn't stop, didn't turn around, just pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the back seat of the car. They watched through the hallway windows as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, carrying Simone out of Dominic's life as abruptly as she'd entered it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Dominic stood staring at the place where the sedan had been, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides, looking lost in a way that might have been heartbreaking if Natalie had any capacity left for sympathy toward him. Instead, she just felt numb, and maybe a tiny bit vindicated. Now Dominic knew how it felt to be abandoned by someone you'd thought was building a future with you. Now he understood the sudden vacuum of loss, the disorienting sensation of having your life plans evaporate in a single conversation. Oliver chose that moment to fully wake up, progressing from small sounds to full-on crying in about 30 seconds. Natalie shifted him slightly, bouncing gently in the rhythm she'd learned he found soothing, but he was hungry and no amount of bouncing was going to satisfy that need. She needed to find somewhere private to nurse him, which meant this hallway conversation was over whether Dominic wanted it to be or not. "I need to feed him," Natalie said, already moving toward the ladies' room at the end of the hall. "Wait," Dominic said, finally finding his voice. Can I talk to you? Please?" Natalie paused, looking back at him. He looked wrecked, completely undone by the past 2 hours. Part of her, a small, spiteful part, was glad. But the larger part, the part that was now a mother and understood love and loss in ways she hadn't before, just felt tired. "Dominic, I need to take care of our son right now. Whatever you need to say can wait." "Our son," Dominic repeated, as if testing out the words, trying to make them feel real. "God, Natalie. We have a son. And I've missed 3 weeks of his life already. 3 weeks I can never get back." "Yes," Natalie agreed simply. "You have. And you'll miss more if you don't get your act together and prove you're actually capable of being a father. Now if you'll excuse me." She continued to the restroom, leaving Dominic standing alone in the hallway, surrounded by the wreckage of both his old life and his new one. Inside the bathroom, Natalie locked herself in the larger accessible stall and settled onto the closed toilet seat to nurse Oliver. It wasn't ideal, she'd have preferred somewhere more comfortable, but it would do. Oliver latched on immediately, his crying stopping as suddenly as it had started, replaced by the contented sounds of feeding. As she sat there, listening to the muffled sounds of the courthouse beyond the bathroom door, Natalie allowed herself to finally process everything that had happened over the past few hours. She'd done it. She'd revealed Oliver's existence. She'd confronted Dominic with the consequences of his choices. She'd watched Simone walk away, proving that the relationship Dominic had destroyed his marriage for was as shallow and unsustainable as Natalie had suspected. And now what? Now came the hard part, figuring out how to co-parent with a man who'd proven himself unreliable and selfish. Now came the supervised visitations, the constant negotiations, the delicate balance of giving Oliver access to his father while protecting him from potential disappointment and abandonment. Natalie looked down at her son, at his perfect little face relaxed in the contentment of a full stomach, and felt the familiar surge of fierce protective love. Whatever happened next, whatever challenges lay ahead, she'd face them the same way she'd faced everything else, one day at a time, with love as her compass and Oliver's well-being as her North Star. When she emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, Dominic was still in the hallway, sitting in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs with his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard her approaching, and Natalie was struck by how much older he looked suddenly, as if the past 2 hours had aged him years. "I'm sorry," he said without preamble. "For all of it. For the affair, for leaving, for not being there when you were pregnant, for missing Oliver's birth. For every single thing I did wrong. I'm so sorry, Natalie. Natalie studied him for a long moment. The apology sounded genuine, felt genuine, but Dominic had always been good with words. He'd talked her into falling in love with him 8 years ago, had convinced her they were building something permanent and meaningful, had made promises he ultimately couldn't keep. Words were cheap. Actions were what mattered. I believe that you're sorry, Natalie said finally. I believe you're experiencing genuine regret right now, in this moment, after watching your girlfriend walk away and confronting the reality of what you've lost. But I don't know if that regret is going to last, Dominic. I don't know if you're actually capable of doing the work required to be a good father, or if this is just a temporary emotional response that'll fade once the shock wears off. I want to try, Dominic insisted. I want to be in Oliver's life. I want to learn how to be his father. Then prove it, Natalie challenged. Not with words, but with actions. Show up for the supervised visitations. Do the work of learning how to care for him. Put his needs before your own convenience. Demonstrate consistency and reliability over time. Because Oliver deserves a father he can count on, not someone who makes grand declarations and then disappears when things get difficult. I'll prove it, Dominic promised. I swear to you, Natalie. I'll prove it. Lena emerged from the conference room then, her expression all business. We're ready to finalize the terms, she announced. Everything's been agreed to by both parties. We just need signatures. They filed back into the conference room, where Gerald Pritchard had all the necessary documents laid out and waiting. The division of assets, the custody arrangement, the child support calculations, the trust fund specifications, all of it reduced to legal language on official documents. Natalie signed where Lena indicated, her signature transforming her from wife to ex-wife, from sole parent to co-parent, from the only person legally responsible for Oliver to one of two. When all the signatures were complete, when the documents were gathered and would be filed with the court, making everything official and binding, Gerald Pritchard stood and offered his hand to Lena. Well done, he said with professional courtesy. Pleasure working with you, Ms. Torres. Likewise, Lena replied, shaking his hand with the kind of firm grip that communicated respect but not warmth. Dominic stood too, but he didn't offer handshakes or pleasantries. Instead, he turned to Natalie one last time, his eyes red-rimmed and his voice rough. Saturday, he asked. You said Saturday at 2 p.m. Saturday at 2 p.m., Natalie confirmed. My address is in the custody documents. Don't be late, Dominic. First impressions matter, even for parents meeting their own children. I won't be late, he promised. I won't let you down. Either of you. Natalie wanted to believe him, wanted to think that this version of Dominic, humbled, remorseful, desperate to make amends, was genuine and lasting. But she believed in Dominic before, had trusted his promises and commitments, and look where that had gotten her. So instead of accepting his words at face value, she simply nodded and walked out of the conference room, out of the courthouse, into the weak November sunlight that seemed to promise that maybe, just maybe, better days were ahead. As she buckled Oliver into his car seat and climbed behind the wheel of her aging Honda, Natalie allowed herself one moment of pure feeling. Pride that she'd survived this ordeal with her dignity intact. Relief that the legal proceedings were over. Anxiety about what came next. And underneath it all, a fierce joy that she had Oliver, that regardless of how he'd come into her life or the circumstances surrounding his conception, he was hers and she was his, and that bond was unbreakable and perfect and exactly what she'd always needed even if she'd never imagined getting it this way. The divorce was finalized. The secret was revealed. Dominic knew he had a son. And now the real work began. Saturday arrived with the kind of grey, dreary weather that matched Natalie's anxious mood. She'd been up since 5 a.m. even though Oliver had miraculously slept for a 4-hour stretch, her mind racing through every possible scenario of how Dominic's first supervised visitation might go. Would he show up on time? Would he actually try to learn, or would he just hold Oliver awkwardly for 2 hours while they sat in uncomfortable silence? Would seeing Dominic in her space, her home, the sanctuary she'd built for herself and her son, feel like a violation? She'd cleaned the apartment obsessively despite it already being clean, needing something productive to do with her nervous energy. She'd reorganized Oliver's changing supplies for the third time, laid out fresh blankets and burp cloths within easy reach, prepared bottles of pumped breast milk even though Oliver typically nursed. She'd showered, dressed in comfortable jeans and a soft sweater, applied minimal makeup to hide the dark circles that were just a permanent feature of new motherhood at this point. At 1:45, Natalie was pacing her small living room with Oliver against her shoulder, bouncing gently and talking to him in the soothing tone she'd perfected over the past weeks. So here's the thing, little man. Your daddy is coming to visit today. I know you don't understand what that means yet, but it's kind of a big deal. He's going to be nervous and probably pretty awkward because he's never done this before. So maybe go easy on him, okay? Don't save your biggest diaper explosion for when he's changing you. Well, actually, maybe do save it for him. It would serve him right. At exactly 2 p.m., and Natalie was watching the clock, ready to note if Dominic was even a minute late, there was a knock on her apartment door. She took a deep breath, sent up a silent prayer to whatever deity might be listening that this wouldn't be a complete disaster, and opened the door. Dominic stood in the hallway holding a massive teddy bear that was almost as tall as he was, looking completely ridiculous and somehow endearing at the same time. He dressed down from his usual business attire, jeans and a simple button-down shirt, both probably expensive but at least not the full suit and tie ensemble that would have been completely inappropriate. His hair was slightly messy, as if he'd run his hands through it multiple times on the drive over, and his eyes were bright with what looked like a combination of excitement and terror. "Hi," he said, his voice coming out slightly higher than normal. "I brought this for Oliver. I know he's too young to actually play with it, but I thought maybe he could have it for when he's older? Or is that stupid?" "It's probably stupid. I didn't know what to bring. Do you bring gifts when you're meeting your 3-week-old son for the first time?" I looked it up online but got conflicting advice. Despite her lingering anger and anxiety, Natalie felt a small smile tugging at her lips. He was trying. It was awkward and over the top and a little bit ridiculous, but he was genuinely trying. "The bear is fine, Dominic. A little excessive, but fine. Come in." She stepped back to let him enter, watching as he maneuvered the giant teddy bear through her doorway and looked around her apartment with poorly concealed curiosity. She saw him taking in the space, the second-hand furniture she'd made cheerful with throw pillows and colorful blankets, the prints of her own artwork on the walls, the corner she'd set up as a makeshift nursery with Oliver's bassinet and changing table. It was tiny compared to the townhouse they'd shared, modest by any measure, but it was clean and warm and full of love, and Natalie refused to feel ashamed of it. "It's nice," Dominic said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Cozy. It's small and the bathroom sink leaks and the neighbor upstairs plays bass at weird hours, but it's ours," Natalie replied, unconsciously holding Oliver a little closer. "Do you want to hold him?" Dominic's eyes widened slightly, that flash of fear back in full force, but he nodded. "Yes. Please. If that's okay." Natalie walked him through the process again, showing him how to support Oliver's head and neck, how to cradle him against his chest, how to hold him securely without squeezing too tight. Dominic's hands were shaking slightly as he took his son, and Natalie had to resist the urge to hover, to snatch Oliver back at the first sign of trouble. This was what supervised visitation meant. She could intervene if necessary, but she had to give Dominic space to actually connect with his child. "Hey there, Oliver," Dominic whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's me again. Your dad. I know I missed the first few weeks, and I'm so sorry about that. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise you that, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." Oliver blinked up at Dominic with those unfocused newborn eyes, making small movements with his hands as if he was trying to figure out who this person was and whether they were trustworthy. Dominic watched his son with absolute concentration, as if Oliver was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen, which Natalie supposed he probably was. They settled onto Natalie's couch, Dominic still holding Oliver with the kind of careful reverence usually reserved for priceless artifacts. The silence stretched between them, not entirely comfortable but not hostile either. Natalie found herself studying Dominic's face, looking for signs of genuine connection versus performance, trying to determine if this moment was real or just another act in Dominic's long history of saying what people wanted to hear. "He looks like you," Dominic said finally. "Around the eyes. And I think he has your nose." "He has your hair," Natalie countered. "And your skin tone. He's going to tan beautifully in the summer while I burn to a crisp like always." "Summer," Dominic repeated, as if the concept of Oliver existing months from now, growing and changing and becoming a real person, was just hitting him. "He'll be 6 months old by summer. Sitting up, maybe starting solids. God, he's going to change so fast, isn't he?" "Babies do that," Natalie confirmed. "Every day is a little different from the day before. It's terrifying and wonderful all at once." "I'm going to miss so much," Dominic said quietly, looking down at Oliver with an expression of profound sadness. "Even with visitation, even if I do everything right and we eventually work up to shared custody, I'm still going to miss half of his life. I'm going to miss milestones and first times and random Tuesday afternoons that probably won't seem important in the moment but will matter when I look back. And that's my fault. That's the consequence of my choices." Natalie wanted to argue with him, to make him feel better, but she couldn't because he was right. He had blown up their family before it even fully existed, and now they were all living with the consequences. So instead of offering false comfort, she simply said, "Yes. That's true." They sat in that truth for a moment, both of them processing the reality of their situation. Then Oliver started to fuss, that pre-cry whimper that meant he was getting uncomfortable about something. Dominic immediately tensed, looking to Natalie with panic in his eyes. "What do I do? Is he hungry? Does he need to be changed? Is something wrong?" "Relax," Natalie instructed, moving closer but not taking Oliver yet. "He's probably just gassy. Try patting his back gently. Like this." She demonstrated the rhythm she'd learned Oliver preferred, and Dominic attempted to replicate it with clumsy but genuine effort. The patting helped, and Oliver let out a small burp that seemed disproportionately large for such a tiny human. Dominic looked ridiculously pleased with himself, as if he'd just accomplished something monumentally difficult rather than simply burping a baby. "I did it," he said with wonder. "I actually helped him." "You did," Natalie agreed, and she found herself feeling something uncomfortably close to warmth toward her ex-husband. "It gets easier. Or at least, you get better at reading his cues and knowing what he needs." They spent the next hour going through basic care tasks. Natalie walked Dominic through changing a diaper, explaining each step and correcting his technique when necessary. She showed him how to prepare a bottle, even though Oliver typically nursed, because there would eventually be times when bottles were necessary. She demonstrated different soothing techniques, the bounce, the sway, the specific white noise that Oliver seemed to find most calming. Dominic took notes on his phone, typing quickly while trying to hold Oliver at the same time, which resulted in several hilarious near-drops that Natalie was ready to prevent. He asked questions, some intelligent, some ridiculous, with the earnest intensity of someone studying for the most important exam of their life. How often did Oliver eat? How much did he typically sleep? What did different cries mean? Was it normal for him to make those weird grunting sounds? Should his poop look like that? And through it all, Natalie found her anger softening slightly, not disappearing but losing some of its sharp edges. Because this version of Dominic, humble, attentive, genuinely trying to learn, was someone she could potentially work with. This version of Dominic was showing up, doing the work, putting Oliver's needs before his own ego. When the 2 hours were up and it was time for Dominic to leave, he looked genuinely disappointed, like a kid being told playtime was over. He held Oliver for an extra minute, just looking at him, memorizing his features. "Can I come back Tuesday?" he asked, still not looking up from Oliver. "I know we said twice a week, but I want to see him as much as possible. I want to learn as quickly as possible." Natalie considered. The custody agreement specified twice weekly, but there was nothing preventing more frequent visits if she allowed it. "Tuesday works. Same time." "Same time," Dominic confirmed. "Thank you, Natalie. For this. For giving me a chance I definitely don't deserve. I'm not doing it for you, she reminded him. I'm doing it for Oliver. I know. But thank you anyway. After Dominic left, Natalie sat in her quiet apartment with Oliver in her arms and tried to process her conflicted feelings. Part of her wanted to maintain her anger, to hold on to her hurt and betrayal as protection against being disappointed again. But another part, the part that was a mother now and understood that Oliver's well-being had to come before her own emotional comfort, recognized that Dominic seemed genuinely committed to trying. The next several weeks fell into a rhythm. Dominic showed up for every scheduled visitation, always on time, always eager to learn. He practiced diaper changes until he could do them efficiently, learned to distinguish between Oliver's different cries, figured out the specific way to rock him that would get him to sleep. He brought appropriate gifts, practical things like diapers and formula and cutonuses that were actually the right size, not the giant teddy bear variety. More importantly, he asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He took Natalie's feedback without getting defensive, adjusted his techniques when she corrected him, acknowledged his mistakes and worked to improve. He started keeping a journal of his interactions with Oliver, documenting milestones and changes, trying to create a record that would help fill in the gaps of the time he'd missed. But while Dominic was learning to be a father, his personal life was falling apart in other ways. His relationship with Simone was officially over. She'd blocked him on all platforms and moved on to dating some tech entrepreneur who posted even more ostentatiously on social media than Dominic had. His mother, Patricia Ashford, had reacted to the news of Oliver's existence with cold disapproval, seeing the baby not as a grandchild to love but as a complication that interfered with the family image she'd carefully cultivated. Dominic's business was suffering too. He couldn't focus on development deals and investor meetings when his mind was occupied with thoughts of his son, with guilt about missed time, with desperate attempts to make up for his failures. Several major projects stalled, clients grew frustrated with his lack of attention, and there were whispers in the industry that Dominic Ashford was losing his edge. None of this brought Natalie any satisfaction. She'd thought it would, thought that watching Dominic's perfect new life crumble would feel like justice, but instead it just felt sad. Sad that so much had to be destroyed for Dominic to finally understand what actually mattered. Sad that Oliver's existence had somehow become a problem to be managed rather than a blessing to be celebrated. 3 months into their visitation schedule, Natalie was settling into a tentative sense of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. Maybe Dominic really was changing, really was capable of being a good father. Maybe Oliver would grow up knowing both his parents, not because a court ordered it but because his father had chosen to show up and do the work. And then one evening, there was a knock on her door at 8 p.m., well outside their scheduled visitation times. Natalie opened it to find Dominic standing there looking haggard, his eyes red-rimmed, his suit rumpled, clearly coming straight from the office. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "Can I come in?" Natalie hesitated. Oliver was already asleep, and she'd been looking forward to a rare evening to herself, maybe a bath, maybe just collapsing on the couch with Netflix and actually paying attention to what she was watching. But something in Dominic's expression suggested this was important, maybe urgent. "Fine," she agreed, stepping aside. "But keep your voice down. Oliver just went to sleep and if you wake him, you're the one putting him back down." They sat in her living room, the space feeling smaller with Dominic's anxious energy filling it. He was clearly working up to something, building courage to say whatever he'd come here to say. Natalie waited, patient but wary, wondering what new complication was about to be introduced to their already complicated situation. "My mother wants to meet Oliver," Dominic finally said, the words coming out in a rush. "She's demanding to meet him, actually. She says it's unacceptable that her only grandchild exists and she hasn't been introduced, that it makes the family look fractured and dysfunctional. She wants to set up a formal meeting, at her house, with her attorney present to discuss appropriate arrangements." Natalie felt her stomach drop. Patricia Ashford was notoriously controlling, the kind of woman who saw people as chess pieces to be moved around according to her strategic goals. She'd never approved of Natalie, found her background too common, her artistic career too impractical, her lack of family connections too problematic. Natalie could only imagine what Patricia thought of this situation, of Natalie having deliberately kept the pregnancy secret, of her grandson being raised in a one-bedroom apartment instead of in the Ashford mansion. "And what do you want?" Natalie asked carefully. I want to tell her no, Dominic admitted. I want to tell her that Oliver is my son, not a family asset to be managed, and that she doesn't get to make demands about when and how she meets him. But Natalie, she's threatening to cut me off from the family trust if I don't comply. She's threatening to use her connections to make the custody arrangement more difficult, to push for changes that would be disruptive to the routine we've established. She's willing to go to war over this, and I don't know how to handle it. Natalie felt anger rising in her chest, hot and familiar. Of course, Patricia Ashford would try to use her wealth and power to control this situation. Of course, she couldn't just be a grandmother who wanted to meet her grandchild. She had to make it a power play, a negotiation, a battle for control. Here's what's going to happen, Natalie said, her voice hard. You're going to go back to your mother and tell her that if she wants to meet Oliver, she can do it on my terms, in my space, with no attorneys present and no discussions of arrangements. She can come here, to my apartment, and meet her grandson like a normal human being. And if she can't manage basic human decency, if she insists on treating my son like a business transaction, then she doesn't get to meet him at all. I don't care about her trust fund or her connections or her threats. I care about Oliver, and I'm not exposing him to toxic family dynamics just because someone with money thinks they're entitled to access. Dominic looked at her with something like admiration. She's going to hate that. I'm sure she will. But that's not my problem, Dominic. You need to decide right now where your loyalty lies. With your mother and her control games, or with your son and doing what's actually best for him. Because I promise you, those two things are not compatible. I choose Oliver, Dominic said without hesitation. Always. I'll talk to her. I'll make it clear that if she wants a relationship with her grandson, it's going to be on terms that prioritize his well-being, not her convenience or social standing. Good, Natalie said, feeling some of her tension ease. Then we'll figure out a time for her to visit. But Dominic, I'm serious, the first time she steps out of line, the first time she makes Oliver feel like he's somehow less than because he doesn't live in a mansion or because his mother isn't from the right family, she's done. I will cut her off completely and I don't care what legal threat she makes. Understood, Dominic agreed. And Natalie? Thank you. For being so fierce about protecting him. He's lucky to have you as his mother. The compliment caught Natalie off guard, made her throat tighten unexpectedly with emotion. She and Dominic had been cordial, even friendly at times during their visitations, but this felt different. This felt like genuine respect, genuine recognition of her worth not as his ex-wife but as Oliver's mother. I'm just doing what any parent should do, she said, her voice rougher than she intended. No, Dominic countered. You're doing what a great parent does. There's a difference. After Dominic left, Natalie checked on Oliver, watching him sleep with one tiny fist curled near his face. He was growing so fast, changing every day, becoming more alert and responsive. Already he was starting to smile real smiles, not just gas-induced grimaces. Already he was tracking movement with his eyes, reaching for things that interested him, making sounds that suggested language would eventually follow. And with those developments came new anxieties. What if Patricia Ashford tried to use her wealth to influence the custody arrangement? What if she convinced Dominic that Oliver would be better off living in the Ashford mansion with nannies and private schools rather than in Natalie's modest apartment? What if money and power won out over love and stability? Natalie pushed those fears aside, refusing to borrow trouble from an uncertain future. She'd face Patricia Ashford when the time came, would protect her son with everything she had, would fight like hell to ensure Oliver grew up knowing he was loved unconditionally, not for what he represented or what family name he carried but simply for being himself. As she settled into bed that night, Natalie realized something surprising. She was lonely. Not for Dominic specifically, that ship had sailed and sunk spectacularly, but for adult companionship, for connection that went beyond the caretaker-infant dynamic that consumed her life. She loved Oliver with an intensity that still surprised her, but she missed having conversations that didn't revolve around feeding schedules and diaper contents. She missed being seen as a whole person rather than just Oliver's mom. She thought about her neighbor, Gabriel Moretti, the pediatric nurse who'd been leaving coffee by her door and occasionally offering to watch Oliver while she ran errands or took a shower longer than 3 minutes. He was kind, thoughtful, asked about her well-being in ways that suggested he genuinely cared rather than just being polite. But the thought of complicating her already complicated life with romantic entanglement made her exhausted before she even began. No, she decided. For now, her focus needed to be on Oliver, on establishing stable routines, on navigating the delicate co-parenting relationship with Dominic. Everything else, including her own desires and needs outside of motherhood, would have to wait. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but think about Gabriel's warm smile, his gentle hands when he helped with groceries, the way he looked at her like she was more than just the sum of her responsibilities. And maybe, just maybe, when things settled down, when Oliver was a little older and life was a little less chaotic, maybe then she could think about what it might mean to let someone new into her life. For now, though, she had enough to deal with. Patricia Ashford. Dominic's continued growth as a father. Her own exhaustion and the constant juggling of work and motherhood. The future stretching ahead like an unmapped territory, full of potential dangers and unexpected joys. Natalie closed her eyes and let sleep take her, trusting that whatever tomorrow brought, she'd find a way to handle it. She always did. Patricia Ashford arrived at Natalie's apartment exactly 1 week later, at precisely 3 p.m., because punctuality was one of the few things she and her former daughter-in-law agreed upon. She came alone, no attorney, no assistant, just herself and a designer handbag that probably cost more than Natalie's monthly rent. She was dressed impeccably in a cream-colored suit that somehow remained pristine despite the November weather, her silver hair styled in an elegant bob that framed features still beautiful despite being in her mid-60s. Natalie had prepared for this meeting like a general preparing for battle. The apartment was spotless, Oliver was freshly changed and wearing one of his nicer outfits, and Natalie herself had dressed carefully in slacks and a blouse that suggested professional competence without trying too hard. She'd mentally rehearsed responses to potential criticisms, had fortified her defenses against the subtle condescension Patricia Ashford wielded like a weapon. But nothing could have prepared her for what actually happened. Patricia stepped into the apartment, her critical gaze sweeping the space as Natalie had anticipated. But then her eyes landed on Oliver, sleeping peacefully in his bassinet, and something in her expression cracked. The imperious mask slipped, revealing something vulnerable and achingly human underneath. "Oh," Patricia breathed, moving toward the bassinet as if pulled by invisible strings. "Oh, he's beautiful." Natalie stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to this grandmother who seemed genuinely moved rather than just assessing assets. Patricia reached out, then hesitated, looking to Natalie for permission before touching her grandson. "You can hold him if you'd like," Natalie offered, surprising herself with a gentleness in her own voice. "He should wake up soon anyway, it's almost time for him to eat." Patricia carefully lifted Oliver, and Natalie was struck by how competent she looked, how natural. Of course, Patricia had raised Dominic, had presumably been through all of this before. She held Oliver with practiced ease, supporting his head automatically, adjusting her grip to keep him comfortable. "He has Dominic's coloring," Patricia observed, her voice thick with emotion. "But your features." And something of his grandfather around the eyes. "My late husband, James." He had the same expression, even as a baby in photographs. Like he was studying the world, trying to figure out how it all worked. They moved to the couch, and for the first time since Patricia had entered the apartment, Natalie allowed herself to relax slightly. This wasn't the confrontation she'd been expecting. This was just a grandmother meeting her grandson, complicated by history but rooted in something fundamentally human. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said suddenly, her eyes still fixed on Oliver. "Several apologies, actually. I've been thinking a great deal over the past weeks about how I've handled this situation, and I've concluded that I've behaved abominably." Natalie blinked in surprise. Patricia Ashford was many things, but apologetic had never been one of them. "I treated your pregnancy as a problem to be managed rather than a blessing to be celebrated," Patricia continued. "I offered you money to essentially disappear, which was not only insulting but suggested I cared more about appearances than about my own grandchild's well-being. I've been cold and judgmental and controlling, exactly the kind of grandmother I swore I'd never be." "Patricia," Natalie started, unsure where this was going. "Please, let me finish," Patricia interrupted gently. "I need to say this while I have the courage. When James died 15 years ago, I think I lost some essential part of myself. He was the warm one, the one who reminded me that love was more important than image, that family meant actually being present rather than just maintaining appearances. Without him, I became harder, more focused on control because it felt safer than vulnerability. And I've hurt people with that hardness, including you, including my own son. Oliver began to stir, making small sounds that indicated he'd be fully awake soon. Patricia continued holding him, swaying slightly in that universal grandmother motion that transcends culture and circumstance. I watched Dominic destroy his marriage, watched him make catastrophic mistakes, and I said nothing because I thought it wasn't my place to interfere. But then you showed up with this baby, and I realized I had a choice. I could continue being the cold, controlling matriarch who valued image over connection. Or I could be the grandmother this child deserves, the grandmother my husband would have expected me to be. I chose poorly at first, but I'm hoping it's not too late to choose differently now. Natalie felt tears pricking at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She'd been prepared for battle, not for this raw honesty, this genuine vulnerability from a woman she'd always seen as untouchable and unfeeling. "What are you saying?" Natalie asked, needing clarity, needing to understand what Patricia was actually offering. "I'm saying I want to be part of Oliver's life," Patricia replied. "Not as the Ashford matriarch who demands and controls, but as his grandmother who shows up and supports and loves him unconditionally. I'm saying I want to build a relationship with you, because you're his mother and the most important person in his world. I'm saying I was wrong to offer you money, wrong to threaten legal action, wrong to approach this entire situation as if it were a business negotiation rather than a family matter." Oliver was fully awake now, looking up at Patricia with those serious green eyes, and Natalie watched as her former mother-in-law's expression softened into something approaching wonder. "Hello, Oliver," Patricia whispered. "I'm your grandmother. And I promise you, I'm going to do much better than I have so far." The weeks that followed Patricia's visit brought changes Natalie hadn't anticipated. Patricia became a regular presence in Oliver's life, visiting once a week with gifts that were thoughtful rather than ostentatious, books rather than designer clothes, age-appropriate toys rather than expensive gadgets. She asked Natalie's permission before buying anything significant, deferred to Natalie's parenting decisions even when she privately disagreed, and gradually earned Natalie's cautious trust. More surprisingly, Patricia became an unexpected ally in Natalie's ongoing navigation of co-parenting with Dominic. When Dominic started pushing for increased visitation hours before the 3-month mark they'd agreed upon, Patricia was the one who reminded him that patience and consistency mattered more than escalation. When Dominic's business associates made thoughtless comments about his baby mama drama, Patricia was the one who shut them down with icy efficiency. "That's my grandson's mother you're disrespecting," she'd told one particularly obnoxious real estate developer at a charity gala. "And if you can't speak about her with the dignity she deserves, you can speak to someone else entirely." But while Patricia was becoming an unexpected source of support, other complications were arising. Dominic's company was in serious financial trouble. A major development deal had fallen through due to his lack of focus during crucial negotiations. Investors were pulling out, concerned about his ability to manage projects effectively. There were whispers that bankruptcy might be on the horizon if Dominic couldn't turn things around quickly. Natalie heard about this not from Dominic himself but from Lena, who kept tabs on anything that might affect Oliver's financial support. They were sitting in a coffee shop while Oliver slept in his stroller, having one of their regular catch-up sessions that kept both of them connected to adult conversation. "His business is hemorrhaging money," Lena reported, scrolling through information on her tablet. "Multiple projects have stalled, and he's burning through reserves trying to keep things afloat. The child support payments are secure for now because they're court-ordered, but if he goes under completely, collecting might become more complicated." "How bad is it?" Natalie asked, feeling a complicated mix of concern and vindication. Part of her, the petty part that still harbored anger about the betrayal, felt satisfied that Dominic was finally facing real consequences for his choices. But the larger part, the part that was Oliver's mother and understood that her son's well-being was tied to his father's stability, worried about what this meant for their carefully constructed co-parenting arrangement. "Bad enough that he might have to sell the penthouse," Lena said. "Bad enough that he's taken meetings with business recovery specialists. I don't think he's going to end up homeless or anything, but the lifestyle he's been living is definitely unsustainable." As if summoned by their conversation, Natalie's phone buzzed with a text from Dominic. "Can we talk?" Not about visitation, something else. Important. They arranged to meet the next day at a neutral location, a park halfway between their respective homes. Dominic arrived looking haggard in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. He'd lost weight, his expensive clothes hanging slightly loose on his frame. His hair needed cutting, and there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he was carrying weight he didn't know how to put down. They walked slowly while Oliver napped in his stroller, maintaining the kind of public civility that had become their default mode. But Natalie could feel Dominic working up to something, gathering courage to broach whatever topic had prompted this meeting. "I'm in trouble," he finally said, the words coming out flat and defeated. "The business is failing. I'm going to have to declare bankruptcy if I can't secure emergency funding, and even that's looking increasingly unlikely. Everything I've built over the past 15 years is crumbling, and I don't know how to stop it." "I'm sorry," Natalie said, and she meant it. Whatever anger she still harbored toward Dominic, she didn't want him to lose everything. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Dominic admitted. "My accountant is suggesting I liquidate most of my assets, downsize drastically, and try to rebuild from a more sustainable foundation. Which means selling the penthouse, selling the car, basically starting over. And I know that shouldn't matter, I know that material possessions aren't what's actually important, but Natalie, I built my entire identity around success. I don't know who I am if I'm not Dominic Ashford, successful real estate developer." They sat on a park bench, watching other families enjoying the autumn afternoon. Parents pushing strollers, kids running around playgrounds, couples walking hand in hand. All those ordinary moments of life continuing around them while Dominic's world fell apart. "You're Oliver's father," Natalie said quietly. "That's who you are, regardless of what's in your bank account or where you live. And maybe that's what you need to figure out, who you are when everything else is stripped away. What actually matters when the image and status and material success are gone." "How are you so calm about this?" Dominic asked, looking at her with something like desperation. "My financial collapse affects you too. It affects Oliver. The child support, the trust fund, all of that becomes less certain if I'm broke." "We'll be fine," Natalie assured him, surprised to find she actually believed it. "I've been poor before, Dominic. I grew up with nothing, built a life from scratch. I know how to be resourceful, how to stretch a dollar, how to prioritize what actually matters. Oliver doesn't need designer clothes or expensive toys. He needs love and stability and parents who show up for him. If you can provide that, if you can be present and engaged and committed to being his father regardless of your financial situation, then that's what matters." "I want to be that," Dominic said, his voice breaking slightly. "I want to be the father he deserves. But I'm terrified I'm going to let him down, that I'm going to fail at this the same way I'm failing at everything else." "Then don't fail," Natalie said simply. "It's actually that straightforward. Show up. Do the work. Put his needs before your ego. You'll make mistakes, every parent does, but as long as you're trying, as long as you're genuinely committed to being there for him, then you're not failing." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Oliver sleep peacefully in his stroller, oblivious to the adult complications swirling around him. And Natalie realized something surprising: she no longer hated Dominic. She wasn't in love with him anymore, didn't want their marriage back, didn't forgive all the pain he'd caused. But she also didn't hate him. She saw him now as a flawed human being trying to do better, making mistakes and learning from them, slowly becoming someone Oliver could potentially be proud of. "Thank you," Dominic said finally. "For not giving up on me being a father. For giving me chances I don't deserve. For being the kind of mother Oliver needs even when I wasn't the kind of father he deserved." "You're welcome," Natalie replied. "But Dominic? The thank you doesn't mean anything if you don't follow through. Words are easy. It's the daily showing up that matters." "I understand," Dominic promised. "And I will. I'll keep showing up, no matter what else falls apart in my life." But Dominic's financial collapse wasn't the only revelation that November brought. The real game-changer came from an unexpected source: Gabriel Moretti, the pediatric nurse who'd been quietly present in Natalie's life for months. It started innocently enough. Gabriel knocking on her door one evening with a casserole because he'd made too much food and thought she might be hungry. Natalie inviting him in because it seemed rude not to, and besides, she was starving and the casserole smelled amazing. Them sitting at her small kitchen table while Oliver slept, eating and talking about nothing particularly important, his shift at the hospital, her upcoming exhibition at a small gallery that was giving her a chance despite her years away from active art creation. "I saw some of your work," Gabriel said, gesturing toward the paintings on her walls. "The pieces you've been doing since Oliver was born. They're powerful, Natalie. Really moving. You have genuine talent." Natalie felt herself flush with pleasure and embarrassment. "They're just emotional therapy, really. Not refined enough for serious consideration." "Sometimes the best art comes from that raw emotional place," Gabriel countered. "Sometimes refinement actually diminishes impact. These paintings, they tell a story about transformation, about strength found in darkness, about beauty emerging from pain. That's not just anything." They talked for hours, long past the point when the casserole was finished and Oliver had woken up for a feeding and gone back to sleep. Gabriel told her about his work at the children's hospital, the joy and heartbreak of caring for sick kids, the way he'd learned to find hope in the smallest victories. Natalie told him about her time in foster care, the way art had been her escape and salvation, the gallery career she'd built and then set aside for what she'd thought was a secure future. And somewhere in that conversation, somewhere between laughing about ridiculous things his co-workers had done and discussing the complicated beauty of parenthood, Natalie realized she was attracted to this man. Not just physically, though he was certainly good-looking in that understated way she'd always preferred. But intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. He saw her as a whole person, artist, mother, survivor, complex human being, rather than just as one thing. "I should go," Gabriel said finally, glancing at the clock and realizing it was nearly midnight. "But Natalie? I'm glad we did this. Glad we got to actually talk instead of just passing in the hallway." "Me too," Natalie agreed, walking him to the door. He paused in the doorway, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Would you want to do this again? Not just talking over leftover casserole, but maybe dinner? Somewhere that isn't your apartment or the hospital cafeteria. Like an actual date." Natalie's breath caught. A date. The word felt foreign, impossible. She'd been married to Dominic for 6 years, with him for 8 total. Before that, her dating life had been sporadic and complicated by her foster care background and general distrust of people. She didn't know how to date as a single mother, didn't know how to navigate the complicated terrain of new romance when her life was already so full of responsibility and challenge. "I want to say yes," she said honestly. "But Gabriel, my life is complicated. I have a 4-month-old baby. I'm co-parenting with my ex-husband who's currently having a financial crisis. I work full-time and barely sleep, and half the time I'm not sure which way is up. I don't know if I have space for whatever this could be." "I'm not asking for space," Gabriel said gently. "I'm asking for a chance. One dinner, Natalie. You and me, an actual adult conversation in a place with tablecloths. I'm not asking you to figure out the whole future right now. Just one dinner." Natalie wanted to say no, wanted to protect herself from the possibility of more complications, more potential heartbreak. But she also wanted to say yes, wanted to remember what it felt like to be desired for herself rather than for what she could provide to someone else. "Okay," she heard herself say. "One dinner. But I need to find a babysitter, and it would have to be on an evening when Dominic doesn't have visitation, and—" "I'll handle the details," Gabriel interrupted, smiling. "You just show up. Well, and figure out the babysitter thing. I'm good with logistics, but I don't think I can help with that part." After he left, Natalie stood in her quiet apartment feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She'd been so focused on survival, on getting through each day and doing right by Oliver, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about her own happiness, her own desires beyond basic needs. But Gabriel's interest, genuine, patient, respectful, made her remember that she was more than just Oliver's mother. She was still Natalie, still a woman with needs and wants and the capacity for connection. She thought about Dominic, about how their relationship had started with passion and excitement but had ultimately crumbled under the weight of unmet expectations and poor communication. She thought about how different Gabriel seemed, more grounded, more present, more interested in who she actually was rather than who he wanted her to be. And she thought about Oliver, about what it would mean to introduce a new person into their carefully structured life. Would dating complicate the co-parenting arrangement? Would Dominic see it as a betrayal somehow, even though he'd been the one to leave, the one to move on first with Simone? Would it be good for Oliver to see his mother happy with someone, or would it just confuse him to have multiple adult figures rotating through his world? Natalie pushed those concerns aside for the moment, deciding that one dinner didn't require answers to all those questions. She could take this one step at a time, could allow herself this small indulgence without committing to anything more. Just one dinner with a kind man who saw her as someone worth pursuing. Surely she deserved that much. But as she checked on Oliver one last time before bed, watching him sleep with his tiny fists curled near his face, she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. Because falling for someone new meant risk. It meant vulnerability. It meant opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again, and Natalie wasn't sure she was ready for that. The universe, however, didn't seem particularly concerned with whether Natalie felt ready. Because the next morning brought news that would change everything and force decisions she wasn't prepared to make. Lena called just after 8 a.m., her voice urgent in a way that immediately set Natalie's nerves on edge. Turn on the news. Channel 7. Right now. Natalie fumbled for the remote while holding Oliver against her shoulder, finally getting the TV on to see a breaking news banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen. The story was about a major real estate scandal, developers taking kickbacks, falsifying inspection reports, putting residents at risk in buildings that weren't up to code. And at the center of it all, named as a person of interest in the investigation, was Dominic Ashford. No, Natalie breathed, watching footage of Dominic's office building, reporters crowding the entrance, speculation about criminal charges and prison time. No, no, no. It gets worse, Lena said grimly. The investigation goes back 5 years, which means it predates your divorce. If Dominic is convicted, if the prosecution proves he was involved in fraudulent activity, the court could order seizure of assets, including the trust fund he established for Oliver. Everything could be frozen or claimed as proceeds of illegal activity. Natalie felt the room spinning, felt her carefully constructed stability crumbling beneath her feet. This wasn't just about Dominic's business failing. This was criminal. This was scandal and investigation and potential prison time. This was her son's father possibly being a fraud and a criminal, and she'd been letting him spend time with Oliver, had been trusting him to be a stable parental presence. What do I do? Natalie asked, hearing the panic in her own voice. Lena, what am I supposed to do? Right now? Nothing. You wait. You don't talk to reporters if they show up at your door. You document everything about Dominic's visitations in case you need to petition for changes to the custody arrangement. And you prepare yourself for this to get a lot uglier before it gets better. After hanging up with Lena, Natalie's phone immediately rang again. Dominic. She hesitated, finger hovering over the decline button, before ultimately answering. I didn't do it, Dominic said without preamble, his voice raw. Whatever they're saying on the news, whatever allegations are being made, I didn't do it, Natalie. I'm being set up by my former business partner who's trying to deflect attention from his own illegal activity. I'm innocent. Are you? Natalie asked, her voice flat. Because I believed you were committed to our marriage, and that turned out to be a lie. I believed you when you said you were just working late, and that was a lie too. I believed you were the man I married, and that person turned out not to exist. So why should I believe you now? Because I have a son, Dominic said desperately. Because I've spent the past 4 months learning how to be his father, trying to become someone he could be proud of. Because I love him, Natalie, and I wouldn't risk losing him by involving myself in criminal activity. You have to believe me. I don't have to believe anything, Natalie countered. What I have to do is protect Oliver. And right now, having a father who's under criminal investigation doesn't feel very protective. Please don't take him away from me, Dominic begged. Please, Natalie. Whatever happens with the investigation, whatever charges they try to bring, don't use this as an excuse to cut me out of his life. I can't lose both my business and my son. I can't lose everything." But as Natalie looked down at Oliver, at his innocent face unmarked by the corruption and scandal swirling around his father, she realized that Dominic's fears about losing everything might be exactly what needed to happen. Because if he was truly innocent, he'd be vindicated and their co-parenting arrangement could continue. But if he was guilty, if he'd been lying and manipulating and breaking the law while presenting himself as a changed man committed to being a good father, then Oliver deserved protection from that toxicity. "I'll wait for the investigation to conclude," Natalie said finally. "Visitation will continue as scheduled until and unless charges are filed." "But Dominic, if you're lying to me, if you're involved in this and you've been bringing that corruption into my home and around my son, I will never forgive you. And more importantly, Oliver will grow up knowing exactly what kind of man his father really was." She hung up before Dominic could respond, before his justifications and explanations could confuse her further. She needed clarity, needed to think, needed to figure out how to protect her son from a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond her control. The doorbell rang, making her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Gabriel, holding coffee and looking concerned. She opened the door, and without saying anything, he pulled her into a hug, careful not to crush Oliver between them. "I saw the news," he said quietly. "I thought you might need a friend." And that simple gesture, that uncomplicated offer of support without expectation of anything in return, made Natalie's decision about dinner remarkably easy. Because here was someone who showed up, who asked nothing except to be allowed to care, who saw her struggling and wanted to help. "I do need a friend," Natalie admitted, her voice muffled against his chest. "I need someone who isn't part of this mess, who isn't Dominic or connected to Dominic or affected by whatever scandal he's created. I need normal, Gabriel. I need something in my life that's just simple and good." "I can do simple and good," Gabriel assured her. "That's actually my specialty." As they settled onto her couch with coffee, Oliver between them sleeping peacefully despite the chaos of adult lives around him, Natalie allowed herself to feel something she'd been denying for months. Hope. Not for reconciliation with Dominic, not for the past to somehow be undone. But hope for a future that could be different from what she'd imagined, maybe even better. Hope that she could be both a mother and a woman, could protect her son while also allowing herself to be cared for. Hope that the hardest parts might finally be behind her, and what lay ahead could be filled with the kind of simple, stable joy she'd been craving. Little did she know, the truly hardest parts were still to come. The investigation into Dominic's business dealings moved with the slow inevitability of a glacier, seemingly motionless on the surface while carving devastating changes beneath. 2 weeks after the initial news broke, formal charges were filed. Fraud, falsification of documents, conspiracy to violate building codes. The prosecutors held a press conference where they detailed years of alleged illegal activity, painting Dominic as the mastermind behind a scheme that had put thousands of residents at risk in buildings that were structurally unsound. Dominic maintained his innocence, hired the best defense attorneys money could buy, though that money was rapidly running out, and continued showing up for his scheduled visitations with Oliver as if his entire world wasn't imploding around him. But Natalie could see the toll it was taking. He looked gaunt, haunted, like a man who'd stopped sleeping and eating in favor of obsessing over legal strategies and worst-case scenarios. Patricia stood by her son, publicly defending him and privately funding his legal defense despite her own accountant's warnings that she was draining resources on what might be a losing battle. She continued her weekly visits with Oliver, never mentioning the scandal directly but often looking worried in a way that made Natalie's anxiety spike. The media coverage was relentless. Reporters staked out Natalie's apartment building, shoving cameras and microphones in her face whenever she tried to leave with Oliver. Her work suffered, the gallery was understanding but couldn't ignore the negative attention that came with employing someone connected, however tangentially, to a major scandal. Her freelance art sales dried up completely as people who'd been interested in her work suddenly ghosted when they made the connection to the news stories. She was rapidly running out of money. The child support payments had stopped once Dominic's assets were frozen by the court. Her savings, never substantial to begin with, were being depleted by necessities and the occasional emergency that seemed to arise with cruel regularity. The stress manifested physically. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, developed stress headaches that made caring for Oliver even more challenging, and found herself crying at unexpected moments, overwhelmed by circumstances that felt increasingly uncontrollable. Through it all, Gabriel was steady. He brought groceries when she was too anxious to face the reporters outside. He babysat Oliver so she could attend meetings with Lena about the legal implications of the scandal. He never pushed for their promised dinner date, seeming to understand intuitively that she had no emotional capacity for romance when her entire life felt like it was falling apart. But Natalie could feel herself pulling back from him too, protecting herself from the vulnerability of needing someone too much. She'd needed Dominic, had built her life around that partnership, and look how that had ended. She couldn't afford to become dependent on Gabriel's kindness, couldn't risk building hope on another foundation that might crumble without warning. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks after the initial charges were filed. Dominic was supposed to have his regular visitation, but he called 30 minutes before the scheduled time to say he couldn't make it. His attorneys needed him for emergency prep for the preliminary hearing the next day. "I'm sorry," he said, sounding genuinely distraught. "I hate cancelling, but this is important. My lawyer says tomorrow could determine whether this goes to trial or if they can get the charges dismissed. I can't miss it." "Fine," Natalie said tersely. "But Dominic, this is the 3rd time you've cancelled in the past month. Oliver might not understand what's happening now, but he will eventually. And he'll remember that his father kept choosing legal defense over spending time with him." "That's not fair," Dominic protested. "I'm fighting to stay out of prison, Natalie. I'm fighting for my freedom, which means I'm fighting for the ability to be in Oliver's life at all. How is that choosing something over him?" "Because it is," Natalie said flatly. "Every choice has consequences, and the consequence of getting tangled up in whatever illegal activity you were or weren't involved in is that you can't be fully present for your son. That's reality, Dominic. And Oliver and I are the ones paying the price for your choices." She hung up before he could argue further, before his justifications could make her feel guilty for being angry. She looked down at Oliver, now 5 months old and becoming more aware of his surroundings, more interactive and responsive. He was smiling regularly now, laughing at silly faces and peekaboo, reaching for objects with increasing coordination. He was developing a personality, becoming a real person, and Dominic was missing it because he was too busy defending himself against criminal charges. That evening, after Oliver was asleep, Natalie's apartment building failed a safety inspection. The landlord had been deferring maintenance, and now the entire building was deemed structurally unsound, not immediately dangerous, but requiring residents to vacate within 7 days while emergency repairs were completed. 7 days to find a new place to live, with no savings, no security deposit money, and a scandal-tainted name that made landlords reject her applications as soon as they Googled her. Natalie sat on her floor and cried, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. This was too much. The scandal, the financial stress, the cancelled visitations, and now forced displacement from the one place that had felt like home. She didn't know how to handle all of it, didn't know how to keep functioning when everything kept getting worse. Her phone rang. Gabriel. She almost didn't answer, ashamed for him to hear her like this, but she was too exhausted to maintain her carefully constructed facade. "My building failed inspection," she said without preamble, her voice thick with tears. "I have a week to find a new place and I can't afford anything and no one will rent to me anyway because my name is all over the news connected to Dominic's scandal and I don't know what to do. Come stay with me," Gabriel said immediately. "What?" "My sister's apartment. The one you stayed in when you first needed a place. She extended her travel, she's going to be gone for another 6 months minimum. It's just sitting empty, fully furnished. Come stay there. No rent, just keep it lived in and maybe water the plants she left behind. It's yours for as long as you need it." "Gabriel, I can't just move into your sister's apartment," Natalie protested, even as relief washed over her at the possibility of a solution. "That's too much, too intrusive. What if you have a safe place to live with your son?" Gabriel interrupted. "What if you stop drowning for a minute and let someone throw you a life preserver?" "Natalie, I'm not asking you for anything except to let me help." You don't owe me romance or gratitude or anything except agreeing to not be homeless when there's an empty apartment available. Natalie wanted to refuse out of pride, out of some misguided belief that accepting help was the same as admitting defeat. But she looked at Oliver sleeping peacefully in his bassinet, thought about trying to find housing while carrying him through viewings, about ending up in some sketchy situation because she was desperate and running out of options, and she made the practical choice over the prideful one. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay. Thank you." She moved into Gabriel's sister's apartment 3 days later, with Lena's help and Patricia's insistence on hiring movers so Natalie didn't have to carry boxes while managing an infant. The apartment was beautiful, a 2-bedroom in a safe neighborhood, hardwood floors, an updated kitchen, windows that let in actual sunlight. It felt luxurious compared to her previous place, and that made her uncomfortable, made her worry about becoming too comfortable with generosity that would eventually have to be repaid. But Gabriel was true to his word, he didn't ask for anything. He helped her move in, showed her how everything worked, and then gave her space. He still brought coffee occasionally, still offered to babysit when she needed it, but he didn't push for more, didn't make her feel obligated to his kindness. Dominic, meanwhile, was unraveling. His preliminary hearing went badly. The judge found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, rejecting the defense's motion to dismiss. His legal team was telling him to prepare for the possibility of significant prison time if convicted. His mother's money was running out, and he was facing the very real prospect of having to represent himself or accept a plea bargain that would mean admitting guilt for crimes he swore he didn't commit. He showed up for a visitation 3 days after Natalie moved into the new apartment, looking worse than she'd ever seen him. His suit was rumpled, his hair uncombed, his hand shaking slightly as he held Oliver. He seemed to be barely holding himself together, functioning on autopilot and sheer determination. "I might have to take a plea deal," he said without preamble, his voice hollow. "My lawyers say if this goes to trial, I could be looking at 10 to 15 years. But if I plead guilty to reduced charges, I'd probably only serve 3 to 5, maybe less with good behavior. But Natalie, I didn't do what they're accusing me of. I was negligent, maybe, I didn't ask enough questions, didn't verify documents I should have verified. But I didn't knowingly commit fraud. I didn't knowingly put people at risk. And now I have to choose between proclaiming my innocence and potentially spending 15 years away from my son, or admitting to crimes I didn't commit and only spending 3 to 5 years away from him." Natalie listened to this confession, holding the weight of Dominic's impossible choice, and felt something inside her crack open. Not love, that was long dead. But compassion. Empathy for someone trapped in a nightmare largely of his own making but still human, still suffering, still her son's father despite everything. "I'm so sorry," she said, and meant it. "I'm sorry you're in this position. I'm sorry Oliver is going to grow up with a father in prison. I'm sorry for all of it. I ruined everything," Dominic said, tears streaming down his face while he held his son. "I had a good marriage, a good life, and I destroyed it because I was bored and selfish and thought I deserved something more exciting. And now I've lost literally everything, my business, my freedom, years of my son's life. And for what? For a few months with Simone? For the ego boost of feeling desired by someone younger? It was all so stupid, Natalie. So catastrophically stupid." Oliver began to cry, sensing the tension in the adults around him, and Natalie gently took him from Dominic's arms. She soothed her son with practiced efficiency, bouncing and shushing until he calmed, while Dominic watched with an expression of such profound loss that it hurt to see. "I don't want him to remember me like this," Dominic said quietly. "When he's old enough to understand, when he asks about his father, I don't want his only memories to be of a man who went to prison. I want him to know I tried, that I showed up for visitations, that I loved him even when I was terrible at showing it." "Then make sure he knows that," Natalie said. "Write him letters. Lots of letters. Tell him stories about your life, your family history, things you want him to know. Tell him why you made the choices you made, what you learned from your mistakes. Be honest with him about your failures, but also about your love. Give him something to hold on to that's more than just my dad was in prison. Will you give them to him?" Dominic asked. "The letters? When he's old enough to understand." "Yes," Natalie promised. "I will." Not because I forgive you for everything you did to me, but because Oliver deserves to know his father as a complete person, flawed and human and complicated, not just as the sum of his worst choices. That conversation marked a turning point in Natalie's relationship with Dominic. They would never be friends, would never fully trust each other again. But they found a way to be co-parents united in their love for Oliver, even as circumstances pulled them further apart. 2 weeks later, Dominic accepted the plea deal. He pled guilty to negligence and falsification of documents, agreeing to a 4-year prison sentence in exchange for the more serious fraud charges being dropped. He would serve at least 3 years before being eligible for parole, 3 years during which Oliver would grow from an infant into a child, developing language and personality and memories that wouldn't include his father. The day Dominic was sentenced, Gabriel showed up at the apartment with Indian takeout and the willingness to just sit with Natalie while she processed her complicated feelings about her ex-husband going to prison. They didn't talk much, just existed in the same space, eating samosas and watching Oliver play with soft blocks on a blanket on the floor. "Thank you," Natalie said finally, "for being here."